Zangye Chelan Tongye Dane Yasu Dane Chechen Dola Benje Zangye Sangye Chelan Sangye Chelan Changshu Pado Dane Dola Benje Sangye Sangye Chelan 다 가서 아주 계좌 당보 고속사디 디인바 마슈진 최최고대 대화들로 동에 미리 비치르스 딘시디기 니만 당보 딩가조 최최고고레스에게 최기 대시딩 아주 치인바 다 가서 튀니버 탱니버 될랑가조 대화들로 동에 미리 비치르스에게 대화도 동에 건지 대단지니 아니 최출루기 개발된 가서 가서 다 딩이디 가장 가서 친사받지 당고 뒤지슈다.
What we've already gone through was on day one, we looked at the original reason of, the main reason of why one needs to practice, which is I need to practice the Dharma. So take me as the subject, I need to practice the Dharma as the predicate because I want to be happy and I don't want to suffer. And so on the first day we looked at what the meaning of practicing the Dharma is, where we looked at what the meaning of Dharma is. And then last week we looked at the reason, which was what happiness and what suffering is and how to identify happiness and unhappiness or happiness and suffering. So we've done that.
다들이 슈에디 카린 있슬람나 대화들로 동의미 되어봤어야지 지고체 가란체 딘지디 가진간조 소소를 자세 랑 추진의 샤네 최초급이 김진디체 다 드링간조 계제셔야지 아니 미국이 시행나 샤제 다 미국이 시행나 샤네 아니 시행기 되는 제단데 딱 한들 시행기 되는 제국 맞추신 시행기 되는 제국을 꼭 말해 구글에서 고유 주제 가르랬으나 아니 시행 대화들로 동행미 비치르세 딘지디체 다 디사모타인체.
So today the reason is the same, which is desire happiness and don't desire suffering. But last week or the previous weeks we looked at it in relation to oneself, and so now it's in relation to others, where so now the syllogism is slightly different. The syllogism is take myself. It follows I have to work for the benefit of others, I have to practice for others, because others desire happiness and don't desire suffering. So that's the new syllogism that we're going to look at today.
다 신 대화 되어 동의 미드비 cherse기 딘지디기 고관낭로라 커진 슈번의 신기 대화 최종 대화기 문진 최종다 동의기 문진 최종 대단 제니 신기 된 제고도 미국에서기 신기 된 제국에서기 신된세기 된들랑 최종기 개발 중세.
So like we saw last week in relation to oneself, where based on how one identifies happiness and suffering in terms of a grosser or a more coarse understanding of happiness and suffering and a subtler understanding of happiness and suffering, and based on one's identification of happiness and suffering, one's wish or one's goal changes proportionate to where one identifies happiness and suffering as. Similarly, even with respect to others, their happiness and their removal of suffering can also be understood as two separate goals based on how one identifies their level of happiness and suffering.
다 심지어 코란 경우에다 심지어 코란 경우에 대화들로 동의 미드비 실세 사모동단디 심지어 코란 속에 원고진 버치 좀 개봐 여러와 다 망쳐버지 대화 동의 미드세 대화디 대외 소원 문주바디 동의 미드바디 동의 소원 문주바디 안 대단 제베 아니 미과 가시지 대가시 대삼실라마도 사모동 토고 말와 심지어 코란 경우에네 다 단단히 쉬고에 가릴라나 케랑 경우에네 랑 경우에네 랑 경우에네 심진기 된체라도 깨지시에 윤데 심진기 대화 동해디 케랑기 랑 경우에네 심진기 대화도 동해서에 가갈로 문지치기 봤어
So when one talks about the happiness of others and the removal of suffering of others, there's two ways you can look at it. One is from their point of view. So how do they identify what happiness is and what suffering is? And that also is going to be commensurate with how their ability is or how able they are in being able to identify and recognize happiness and suffering. But what we're talking about here is not their ability or how they identify with happiness and suffering, but what we're looking at over here is how do we identify the happiness and suffering of others. So it's not how do they see their own happiness and suffering, but how do we, who are now the subject, considering benefiting them, how do we consider and evaluate what is their happiness and what is their suffering. That's what we're looking at.
다 배순시 슈베 있나다 제곰기 나르디긴기 아니 심진지 통보이나 아니 딘데기 심진 대라 동해세에게 사모코르연데 제곰기 소르바 동해 제곰기 소르바 동해 문주바 디세에게 사모동해직 수송원이다 다 딘데기 제곰기 동해데 파세에게 탑신델라 가서 또 진행 들어봐 세 사마 진행 들어봐 디 진바이나 카두코나 제곰기 동해데 세도 그러봐 다 디니니 디스 고와디 체로 당제 다다 심진 디 제공기 나르바디 아니 nger 진베 소 마조바 디기 너밍 디부 찹다 디 레기 디부로 차디기 여바인데 아니 단단히 사마 진바 대삼식이 그 체세직마도 그게 페마소와 또 코로 딘디기 가사들라 딘디기 동에들레 딘디기 동에데 고 부장중부 사모당제 저에게 사모로 땅부이나 딘디디 진베기 아니 개발라 진베기 레라야 거버셔 디코와디 치료로서 디지슈
So for example, when if you consider someone who's suffering from hunger and thirst, when you consider that level of suffering, you can consider it in two ways. One is noticing that they are suffering from hunger and thirst, which means that the immediate necessity or what they need in the immediacy is something to eat or something to quench their thirst. One level of wanting to remove that suffering is to give them food and drink. But another way, when one can look at the same suffering of hunger and thirst that they are going through and consider it, is that one can see and understand that their suffering that arises from hunger and thirst is the result of having not engaged in or having been miserly or abstained from generosity. And so realizing that the suffering of hunger and thirst that they're experiencing is the result of previous actions of being stingy or miserly and not engaging in generosity, in the practice of generosity, with the wish to benefit them instead of just giving them something which is immediately in the short term going to benefit them. But if you want in the long run for them to be benefited by one's action or to be freed from hunger and thirst, not just right away, but in the long run, then the way you engage or the activity that you do is you try and bring them onto the path or into the practice of generosity. So you encourage them in engaging in generosity. So with the same level of hunger and thirst and the same suffering, one can consider it in two different ways.
소자다 고와 대다 제인데 아니 신된 세디 카도 체세기 코랑기 똑비 동에 세기 신된 대자 많이 마시 딜레 다동파 신된 세디 아니 신 개월 거야 디 신된 차버다.
So here in this case, benefiting or the benefit of others, when you're working for the benefit of others, the benefit of others here is not just removing their suffering of hunger or thirst, but it is benefiting them by bringing them onto a virtuous path or to engage in virtuous practice.
다 다동 가장 아주 쉬디에게 대화들로 동해 미드비 치르세기 동해 매바스 동해 매비 대화세디 사진 일는 게 풍부매바 딜로 공부시해봐이나 딜로 공부시해봐이나 아니 신된 세디 신 풍부매비 양일이 디비 인걸 거야디 디 신된 차가다.
So now the benefit of others has gone from immediate relief from hunger and thirst to benefiting others by bringing them onto the virtuous path. But like we discussed last week, if one can identify suffering as the aggregates, then the benefit of others will be bringing others onto a state of cessation from or liberation from the contaminated aggregates. So now your benefiting others has increased in its scope and in level, where it's not just virtue but it's also the benefit of others, which is now being identified as eliminating the contaminated aggregates.
빼나가도 직대형 호랑이 나로 정아도 지소 호랑이 자와 나로라 미 벤조기 퐁딩에 강에 체딩에 지글라 그렇게도 의도도 진행해봐서야 그런 초하게 얘기치도 의지해직 편도체직도 와. 다 디강라 그런 벤조기 퐁제 초 무드는 강에 체딩이 유도 그런 벤조 그룹 제단계 총 잡단시 랍시 그런 거로 벤조 소단시 랍이나 디펜도디 야처치 말고라.
So for example, if you see poverty, when you see there's poverty in society, one thing that you can do to try and relieve poverty is you can just give them goods, or you can give them things to relieve that immediate poverty. But when you see that this is not a long-term prospect or it's not a sustainable prospect, what you do is you teach them how to accumulate wealth. So you teach them, and it's not just relieving their poverty by giving them material things, but you give them, you educate them in how to be self-sufficient. So you teach them means or tools on how to accumulate wealth for oneself. So maybe you teach them business or something like that.
다 딘디기 미텔라 수가딩 채워라 컷 체세텔라 그런 의지 매매 가도들 체세 의 중중지 쟁에 디까지 채워 요래 양 그런로 의소단 랍제 제마 그런 의수현샤 아니 변조기 마풍어 제윤데 로고칭이 니버디 가딩 채워 요래 집이나 니버디 벳 가딩 채워도와.
So if you then consider who is kinder amongst these two, someone who just gives money when they see poverty, or someone who educates people or teaches them means or tools to accumulate their own wealth in the future. If you consider these two and you ask who is kinder amongst these two, it's not the one who's just given some sort of donation or just given you money. That's the one who's trained you or taught you or made you self-sufficient in your own way to accumulate wealth for yourself.
어떤 치마 디까딩 채워 여번나시 나랑서 최정해지기 신된 체에서도 가두이는 신된 체야디 아니 심지어 파로보디 대위 줄 거야. 안 대위 균나로라 라보섬 여번나네 타르도 아니 벤도 양을 대위 줄 파고야. 디 신된 공부섬 땅고 그래. 디 김전의 된제 나랑서 벽이 라마지기 솜버래. 신된스라기 신기 된세디 신 양대 거야라 공부하고 그래서 신된이 신주기 양대를 샤고 그래서 어디 송여래 디 송샤바디 된다는가 전부 요래.
So when you then talk about benefiting others or the benefit of others has a larger scope than just what it appears to be in the immediacy, where it is not just benefiting others understood generically, but it is benefiting others by providing the causes for their happiness. And because the causes of one's happiness are various, for example, we have the 3 trainings and other such things. When we're talking about the benefit of others or the real benefit or the cause of their well-being, it's actually going to be the liberation that they attain. So benefiting others is best understood as making sure or doing something in a manner where others are able to be liberated. So there is one Tibetan Lama who has said, the best benefit for others is their attaining cessation or their attaining liberation. So when you think, I want to work for the benefit of others, what one should think or what one should recognize as the benefit of others is their liberation. So the liberation and the cessation that they attain is the correct way to think about benefiting others or the benefit of others. So it's a very valid way to think about it. It makes sense.
So shendunche slave기 shengi twendi 파로보기 초와 동영문주와 태세태세기 아니 동행들이 껴비야 소로 내바이는 내요주게 소로 아니 세명에나 세진야 소로 근데 태세태세기 근데 셰디야 shendun게제 셰고 충분이나 shendun세의 대삼신의 공부 셰고 제나 안 지즈밀러리버 shendun제 제면소로 저다.
So if one's identification of the benefit of others is identified as benefiting others by just removing their manifest suffering, where we talk about the sensation of pain or the sensation of suffering. For example, if our identification of the benefit of others is removing them from suffering, manifest suffering such as sickness, disease, poverty, things like that, then when one considers Jitsu Milarepa, it seems like he's not done anything to benefit others.
레디니 지즈밀러레발라 코란기 또 로마치기 또 지즈밀러레베 키랑 공바민도 공바지기 샹 로마민도 로마카시 수 뒤제 공바지기 샹또 라마 심바주 나나나시 그런 든디지 나는 심징이 되잖아 야고 누워서야 쉬운데 응아질로 공견데와 대가는 심징이 돼 있어.
So someone once asked Jizumila, he said, why don't you establish a monastery? Why don't you get disciples? Why don't you teach them? Why don't you do things that are benefiting others the way other lamas also do it? To which Jitsumila replied, my staying in the cave in the mountain all by myself is working for the benefit of others.
어디 들으셔? 소소 다 디인디 땅안 저기 신기 된 최고의 세계 신된 세대. 신된세디 신주기 양대로 공부도 시에나 다 신주기 양대라 신된세디 신주기 양대라 샤네 다 신양일에 대발라파 거버 제바디 신된 제비게 자르다 다 신된 제비 된다디리 다디 제발라 아니 계기 쪼고 가르스니 니레 디 제발라 계기 쪼고 니레 찍디 가르스나 랑기 규마 되거디 계기 쪼고 찍래 랑기 규마 되거디 계기 쪼고 찍래 니버디 아니 시야나 제비 캬마 되거디 강에 니버 계기 니버리.
So when you talk about benefiting others, the others' benefit, the benefit that they derive is this liberation that they attain. So identifying benefit of others as the liberation of others. And one's actions of benefiting others therefore will be making people attain liberation. So one's effort that leads to attaining liberation is one's actions that are beneficial to others. Now to be able to do this, there's two main obstacles. The first obstacle to be able to do this is not being able to tame one's own mind or not being in control of one's own mind. That's one obstacle. And the other obstacle is where one's kindness and love doesn't pervade or doesn't flow to all sentient beings equally.
So that the Indi gag tambodi rangi gu matuwadi shendun chebe gag indi shengi tuen chebal rangi gu tu wang to drogo so seche ani jerum chege lani chumon songbadi tanda chumbo peyor.
So because not having tamed one's mind is an obstacle to benefiting others, Lama Tsongkhapa in the Lamrim Chemu, he says, having to taming one's mind is benefiting others. And it has a lot of meaning. What he's saying is very meaningful.
아니 계속 좀 시월하게 양 춘주 나올 대가랑 송여. 가리 송여스라나 랑규기 녀몽디 마좀 버체지 생기 녀몽 매버 속인스라나 딩뇽비케 자리에서 시월하게 지지 송여.
Similarly, Shantidev and the Bodhicharya Avatara, he says, without having removed one's afflictions, going around claiming to be able to or want to remove the afflictions of others is crazy person's talk. And he's written one verse where he mentions this.
디기 가리따 땡 가리 돔디 가리 송고르라나 생기 된체발 랑기 규드 봉고도 조고 그래서 디기 된다도디 응을 랑규기 녀몽 디바디 파좀 고고 요바디 송고요다.
So what these two statements or what this generally means is that if one genuinely wishes or desires to benefit others, then one has to first have completely removed one's own afflictions.
손자다 신진치야 고카두 삼고리 슬라위인데 라마카지기 중이 되면 무슨도 마통거 봐도 생기 된치야 고마점 된데 송kenyor. 배나 냐면 다불하지기 지즈밀라랑이 두제 경에 고카두 쪽으로서 컨디션인데 아니 지밀레기 계란 중이 무슨도 통거래서 이마지기 중이 무슨도 통거래서 계란 뒤통에 카드 될라 아니 파긴 갈라 남균도 면제 대박 믹스지기 그래서 뒤뒤 결혼 두제 경에 고잡는 지그래서 된데 까나요.
So, certain lamas have said, when do you start benefiting or when do you start working for the benefit of others? They have said that the moment you start working for the benefit of others is when you have direct realization of emptiness. So, for example, when Gampopa asked Jitsu Mila, when will it be time for me to start working for the benefit of other sentient beings? Jitsu Mila said, there will be a moment when you will have direct realization of emptiness. At that point, you will have a uncommon or a very special, strong devotion towards me. And that moment is when you will have to start working for benefit of beings.
되네 ngaransu 신든 신에게 강사 신시라고디 고주서디 박비긴디 시고래. 안 박비긴디 생에디 덴바통에는 시고르와. 소자 지즈밀레기 단다 콩을 송대야 되단더니 림보치 차기였다. 된다니 딱딱 튕겨였다.
So when we talk about illustrations or examples of who is a suitable candidate who can work for the benefit of others, we talk about the third object of refuge, which is the Sangha. And when we talk about the object of refuge, which is the Sangha, this Sangha is identified as beings who have directly seen reality or directly seen the truth. So when Jitsu Miller told Gampopa that you will work for the benefit of others only when you directly realize reality or emptiness, it fits very well with the idea of the Sangha as an object of refuge.
다 강다르장 박비 긴둥이 싸마톱나 박비 싸 마토바이나 박비 긴둥 차두고 메레 박비 긴둥 마차바이나 갭소 여바디 차기 메르다 돈다도도 소장 간조 갭소 로와라 마타이마 박비 고방 토고 그래서 송대야디.
So until you attain the Arya state where you are an Arya being or a noble being, you are not able to, you don't qualify as Arya Sangha, which is the object of refuge, so the community, but it's not just a community, it's the noble community of beings who have direct insight into emptiness. Until you attain this state, you are not a fit candidate to be an object of refuge. You cannot offer refuge to anybody. So for you to benefit others or to be at a state where one can work for the benefit of others or be suitable or a suitable candidate for that, the beginning, the first stage when you're a suitable candidate for that is when you have direct insight into emptiness.
되니 조지 반대 아디샤기 심정이 된체발라 마타이 몽무시기 또고 줄이 덴바지고 그랬어.
Whereas Atisha, when he explained what is the bare minimum requirement that you need for being able to benefit others, he says that the bare minimum requirement is when you have these super knowledges or clairvoyant states.
다 라바숨기 연대 여바체 디강라 세고다 한다. 라바숨기 연대 여바체 디강라 아니 의식이 연된데 맛있고 그랬어.
So it's not just any kind of clairvoyant state, but it's a clairvoyant state that is above and beyond already having perfected the three trainings. So when you have perfected the three trainings and you have clairvoyance, then that level of clairvoyance becomes the first state when you are a worthy candidate of working for the benefit of others. That's how George Atisha spoke of it.
근데 저런 부채기 라린 주문나로라 도대긴지 롱창제 도대긴기 라미치니 신년 두어시고 니시고 연된 라버스지 롱기초 데니 랍도 또 마킨디 제외다니 교업방라 댄세기 롱디 마타나시 아니 롱디기 연된 주된지 송샤바 디낭로네 소다 긍행시험바디 심징이 된시바로 긍행시험바디 가르르스나 라버스움도 거니 규둘 생애지다 안 두절 세와용 된대지 다 마탈을 구글에서 신된시바
Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim Chemo, however, he recites this, he quotes one verse from the Sutra Alamkara, the ornament of the sutras by Maitreya, where there's the definition of a teacher is given, and it's qualified as someone who has 10 characteristics. And amongst these characteristics, the ones that Lama Tsongkhapa considers to be bare minimum requirements for you to be able to teach or work for the benefit of others is someone who has tamed their own mind through the practice of the three trainings and has love towards sentient beings. So without these two, Lama Tsongkhapa doesn't qualify someone to be a teacher. So as a bare minimum requirement, according to how Lama Tsongkhapa is citing from Maitreya's text, he says you have to have completely tamed your mind through the three trainings and you have to have love towards sentient beings.
다 단단히디 슈고에 닝부디 가르슬나 신 심지 풍골 하마미비 양일리 디비 잉라 거바디 니기 차와레 신된싱이 강사디게다 차와디루와 차와디 임바 인디 디 심지 딘디게 하마미비 양일리 디비 잉데라 거단디 거에기 탑람디 가르르세나 최 버식송바들 최 버식송바들 마도 셴바 요마레 델라 공네 전다 딜 미체 아니 좀 된데기 도연낭로라 투는디고 추임이지 조유둥이 차기 미슬 니기 똑업던 보고 시행라 보면베 춘이 덴바된베 줘봐 교르세 시지도 송버다.
The reason why I'm saying this, or like the essence of what I'm saying, is that if the benefit of others or others' benefit is to be understood, not if it is to be. It is to be understood as a state where they no longer have these aggregates, the contaminated aggregates. If that is the state that is beneficial to all other sentient beings, then my job, if I want to benefit sentient beings, is to ensure that they attain that state. And for them to attain such a state, the only thing that I can do, which is the only way that I can benefit them, is teaching the Dharma or explaining the Dharma to them. And with this in mind, the Buddha has said that famous verse which says, not by washing their sins away with water or by my hand can I eliminate anything. The only thing that I can do is teach or show you the Dharma.
다 춘이 덴바 땡당디 간데르슬람나 춘이 덴데레서 디셰자데 대삼시 춘이 덴바 덴베 고발 두고 요마리 춘이 랑랑 운도 균네 셴라 덴바디 춘이 덴바 덴베 퇴시 춘이 랑기 또셰 아니 셴라 덴바디 춘이 덴바 덴베 퇴시 디인디 셴라 춘이 딱 간데 셴라 춘이 땡디 셴 춘이 또에게 쳐들어와 랑기 마도버 아니 가니 다 춘이 지점 매버 있나야 디 춘이 덴바 덴베 퇴는 누구 요마리 손자 디인디 셴 춘이 마도버 또버 쳐발라 랑기 춘이 땡디 춘이 땡버버 라니기야 춘이 요코와들로 차버시고 춘이 또버시고 여러분 디인디 랑기 마도나 셴라 땡바디 춘이 덴바 덴베 코와를 두고 요마리.
So then if the teaching the Dharma is teaching reality or the nature of how things are, which we say teaching the truth or emptiness, then what qualifies as teaching emptiness is not sitting there or being able to give very eloquent explanations or descriptions of emptiness. So showing emptiness or teaching emptiness to someone else means by resting in a state or by having realized emptiness, explaining and conveying one's own realization of emptiness to others or explaining it to them is the meaning of teaching the Dharma. So for one to be able to teach the Dharma or to teach emptiness, reality, the truth to others, it's not sufficient just to be able to explain it verbally, but it is something that has to happen after oneself has realized it, and then through one's own realization, one is transmitting it to somebody else. Just talking about it or explaining it doesn't qualify as showing the truth or teaching the truth to someone else.
다 딘데기 춘이 덴바디 파텐 용데 뒤제기 캄 뒤저 코랑기 삼로 뒤저 코랑기 깨왕은 능게 박자 가와 유메 다 타미데바 쇼지 여바 인데 심진 가실라 춘이기 박자 여바 카두 춘이 된 롱와 가실라 춘이 된바 이나 내가들 미롱와 딘데기 여바 인데 아니 술라 된 롱도 미롱 아니 코로나 심진 대다 대라 춘이 땜바 이나 춘이 탈론 간지군의 땜구고 요매 디탐지기 내가도 시제 야구전의 시험에 통해 아니 춘이 땜단디 심진이 돼 탈침 버쳐다 됐다.
So then when oneself has such a realization, then being aware or being cognizant of what another person's ability is, what their character is, what their personality is, where they're placed, where they stand in terms of what they have familiarized with, what they need, what they require, how much they're able to understand. With a complete understanding of this, and then also understanding whether they are suitable candidates to hear a teaching about emptiness, or will hearing a teaching about reality, about emptiness not be appropriate for them. Having completely understood them, their predispositions, their abilities, how much they can understand and whether they are suitable candidates to hear such a teaching, then with this complete knowledge, being able to teach the Dharma or being able to teach reality, emptiness to someone else is the actual meaning of explaining emptiness to someone else.
So that 딘데기 심진이 된 탈침 버쳐발라 바르도 주주기 디바디 시제 디바 임바 인디 아니 시제 디바 방면 남아 탐지신비 이시세 때다 고생이 된 탈침 버쳐발라 디쿠고요다.
And because what prevents us from having this kind of complete realization or understanding of exactly where someone stands, what their state of mind is, what they need, what prevents us from knowing this is known as the cognitive obscurations, because those are the obstacles for us being able to benefit others in the most appropriate way. That's why we say that to attain a state where one is perfectly being able to benefit others, one needs to remove the cognitive obscurations. So one needs to stay in a state freed from these cognitive obscurations.
다 단기 주어지 번에 아디셔기 신된셔 발라 무시 구글에서야디 어디 순거다 무시 운이 지dengi 무시 여바이나 안 심진디 깨원가마 칸이 세편의 연구유매 깨원가는 걸 바자 가르가리 유매 디신기 여바 송자 안 고랑기 캄도 삼바도 템베 톤네 아니 디 춘이 최대한의 연구 여바 송자 다 디순거 주어지 번에 아디셔.
So when George Atisha said you need clairvoyance to be able to benefit others, what he means is this: if you're not clairvoyant and you don't have clairvoyance about which previous incarnation they were, where they were, what they were familiar with, where they're coming from, what baggage they have, how they think, what they need, how they're thinking, if you're not able to gauge perfectly the thoughts and the predispositions of others in a particular moment, you're unable to teach the Dharma in the most appropriate way for them. So because you need this to be able to show emptiness in the most accurate way for each individual person, based on that, George Atisha said you need clairvoyance to be able to teach the Dharma.
So that digi domdabudi 심진남 대화들로 동의 미도바 임비칠 세계 아니 대화들로 동의 미도바 고아 차보 디스 공바시 딘디기 고아 대단 제니 아니 신된디 신주기 양대 아니 신 양대로 고발라 아니 랑기 유기 디바방고에 직체 되니 시행기 된 심진 탐지기 된 세발라 아니 넘버 탐지신비 20매나 심진 탐지기 된 세바디 누기메바 손상 아니 신된도 장주 시행기 된도 장중문도 시되게 아니 셈계단디 고림바 도신이 연구였다.
So now with this you have, if when you come back to the original syllogism, which is the benefit of others, so make the happiness of others and the removal of suffering of others, if you identify it accurately for what it really means, and you can accurately identify it in its most subtle version or in its most complete understanding, then the benefit of others, or a state where others are benefited, is when they have attained liberation or cessation from suffering. And when you realize that that is the state and you want to attain that state, then what is preventing you from attaining that state is the various obscurations that one has. And so, with the wish to attain a state where one is free of these obscurations, which is the state of complete Buddhahood, which is a state freed from all obscurations, then with the wish to attain a state freed from all obscurations, you're doing this for the benefit of others. That's why we say the mind is the mind that wishes for illumination, or the aspiring mind is a mind that, for the benefit of others, or with the motivation of wanting to benefit others, aspires for the state of Buddhahood, which is a state devoid of those two obscurations.
다 디기 가르쳐 버리려나 대화들로 동의 미드비 칠세 디기 아니 탈방원도 최고에게 삼로도 직체 대화들로 신 대화들로 랑 대화들로 동의 미드비 칠세 디기 탈방원도 전도기 삼로게 직체 신 대화들로 동의 미드비 칠세 디기 삼로디기 돈에 장주셔도 셈기고에게 고원이 되면 버린 이 정도 장주sem이 고원이 된 거예요.
So, I want to remove the suffering of others, and I want to make others happy. When we have understood it in this way, within this statement or within this phrase itself, there is already the meaning there is an underlying meaning that suggests I want to attain liberation because they need to attain liberation. So there is within it the desire to attain liberation, and there is within it also the desire to attain Buddhahood for the benefit of others. So within this very statement, I want to ensure that others are happy and others are not suffering. Within this statement itself, there is already the meaning of renunciation and bodhicitta, which is already there. It's already present in this one single statement.
다 단다 돔 밥사디 인중도 자주 셈니를 밥소와 다디 가르치니 밥 될 나도 디 쉬고야 돼 내가 디 가르치하고 요스 라비나다 땅 아주 상마 니마를 개조직 제거로 말한서 상미 취해 제디고 와 다 수수에게 단다봐도 취해 제샤와 빼는 인샤 추지로 수수기 개와 취해 가르 두고요나다 수수기 개와 가르 두고다 취해 명다 제 가르 두고요나 가르 제기요나 수수기 냠네 약슈 가리 당게 냠네 약슈 디세게 수수를 신시주요라 봐 어디 수수로로 차라바체 다 딘디기 냠넨데 소소게 딱 얘기 냠네 약슈디 디 뷰탁슈디 디 얘기 딱 빼 연하면은 디 세게 소소기 신시주요로 디 소소 신시로로 차바체 딘디디 최전의 샤 딘디디 최전의 샤니 딘디디 타르비 주 미룬데 타르비 주 마인데 니중기 삼비심바도 제외시스 풍보매비 냥대군도 친되기 삼바도 제외시스 다도 꿰베이나 아니 다도 추숨 상기도 상기민도 나지시어버리.
So, in summary, or this statement, since this statement already summarizes within it or contains within it an idea of renunciation and bodhicitta, now if you think about it, consider whatever virtuous actions we do in a day. So, whatever our practice of dharma is, we're practicing the dharma. And of all the various things that one does in a day which are considered dharmic activities, now take individually each one, the one that one feels is the purest or the best or the greatest thing that one has done in terms of it being the purest, best, clear and cleanest activity that we do, which we consider to be the best form of practice that we do, whatever that might be. Now take that as an example of one's practice and take that as the subject of one's syllogism. So take that activity or that virtuous act that one does, or this dharmic activity or practice that we do, and take it as one subject, and then take this thing. It follows it is not a cause for liberation because it is devoid of the wish for renunciation, or it is devoid of, it is not motivated by the wish to attain liberation from the contaminated aggregates. Now make this syllogism and see whether within this syllogism you can say the reason is established or there is pervasion or not. So ask yourself this.
다 딘데기 댄시디 따드 꾀용데 딘데기 따드 따마룹 세기 렌지 수수기 갸베라나 아니 계란기 강 둡디에기 최디 타비줄을 두고 요르다 땅 타르바톰데 풍고메베 양대웅도 진되기 삼베 신데바지 신데바지 이나 아니 마심바 따마루 라투바 이나 심바 차로 디 신소나 디 타르비줄을 두고 요르 타르비줄을 두고 요바인디 결혼로 대우 체셔리 결혼게 강 둡데바디 노르기 메리 타르비줄을 도디기 요르 다 개데 따마루 세지 라야라기 민두나 안 따춥데 버와 따춥데 버이나 계란게 강 제샤비 최디 냥데를 믹지 제기 메바디 냥데기 삼비 심바디 멤바디 타 쳐버인디 탈비규 말해 탈비규메나 탈비규 로조 가래라 코르와레 디인디 코로코비 규르마도 코로와 나로기 대와짐비 규르직 루그르마도 코로와리 트비 규르 루그요 말해 금진 텔라공네 지rum부체기 라리 춤은 나로라 니중기 삼베다 대코나니기 찌심바지 마중바이나 계란기 개와강 룹샤바디 군중랑가와레스 군중데바 둥이데바 끼지기규 코로핀지기규 딘디기 군중랑가와지 레마도 신케 마레스지 디 지rum부체기 송 라리 춤은 송도와 디베 nenga 춤보레.
Now, so come back and think about the syllogism and take whatever dharmic practice one does. So take that practice, and then your predicate or what you're trying to prove is that it is not a cause for liberation, and the reason that you're giving yourself is because it's not motivated with the wish to attain a state freed from the aggregates, which is another way of saying it is not motivated by renunciation. If you ask yourself this and you give yourself this syllogism or you give yourself this reason, and then to this reason you can say the reason is not established for yourself, which means you are saying that your actions that you have done or your practice is motivated or is driven by renunciation, is driven by the wish to attain liberation, then you can be comfortable, relaxed, and sure that whatever you're doing is acting as a cause that is leading in that direction. Whereas if you realize that what you're doing, whatever you might believe might be the best form of dharmic practice that one does, if what I am doing is not motivated by renunciation, is not driven by renunciation, is not pushed forward by renunciation, then you can be sure that whatever activities you're doing are not going in that direction. So they're not a cause for attaining liberation, they're not a cause for attaining cessation. And so they're not a cause for attaining genuine happiness. Which means, since the opposite of that is samsaric happiness and is just samsaric well-being, because the opposite of liberation is samsara, then whatever activities one is doing are merely causes for samsaric happiness or samsaric well-being. And with this in mind, Lama Tsongkhapa again in his Lamrim Chemo, he says, whatever activity you do, if it is not motivated by renunciation and it is not accompanied with an understanding of emptiness, it is just an ordinary truth of causes. It is just the second of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of causes. So it is just another cause for remaining in samsara. It's not a cause for attaining liberation.
타르발 미제 타르방우도 주되기 삼베기 마심비 아니 게베사와 딘조 타르비줄 도초그레 اسلام나 도초그로 와슬람나 티 누구 말레스 디 게베사와 시행 강다 강 임바 이나야 디 타르비줄 도민도디 코랑 랑도금마 임바 인지민지 시행질로 떼고고요다 떼는 거니 샤나마도 코랑 카두 그런 탈비 주체 되기 기회사와 차투고요 말에. 답변은 가지고 된대 여러분. 아니 녜 락발로 뮤지 요베이나다 녜 락발로다 고무 직동지 요베이나 디 가발로 표주 지기레스 라베이나 디 가리기 귤로 두그레스다 칼라사에기 귤로 두그르베 콜로뉴에기 귤로 두그르베 때무다에기 귤로 두그르베 가리기 귤로 두그레스 라베이나 따디 코랑 뮤 코랑 랑도기 테드 디 귤로 도당 요 말 따디 미디기 삼발 떼고 그러 신규 신질 떼고 그래 삼발 떼고 그래 따 미디기 칼라 산되기 되바 삼바들 칼라 사이기 되바지나 뮤디 아니 칼라 사이기 귤을 땅 거지 미디 그로 뉘에기 삼바 요딩게 지요바이나 그고도 세기 삼바 지요바이나 디 귤을 파트로지 그러 어 딘나 신 제제 나라주 류다 나다 딘데기 계획자와 간지지 싸바 있네야 코로 랑도기 랑외니 코라 두체제 타비 귤라 탐지신비 귤로 두스 도샤에 개요 말해 따디 드로바디 냐버도 삼발 떼고 봐. 따 삼바 가리기 또비 그 개와도 두기도. 소 삼바델라 타발을 미제. 풍부미비 양엘에 대바 세기 삼로 디코딩이 짐이나 아니 디 타빈 줄로 돼야지. 디메나 안 타빈 줄로 두고 말이. 소자 캐바 마중 세 랭갑투사 요 말이에요.
So one might feel or one might want to say that, well, can't some sort of virtuous activity that we do, even if it's not kind of motivated by these things, why is that virtuous activity not a cause for liberation? It could be, right? Potentially. And the answer to that is no, it can't. And the reason is because whatever virtue one accumulates, the virtue in and of itself has no ability to go in any direction. It requires something else that directs it. For example, if I have 1,000 rupees in my hand, whether these 1,000 rupees are going to become a cause for my eating food, or whether they're going to become a cause for buying new clothes, or whether they're going to become a cause for me going and watching a movie, is not something that is inherent to the money itself. It's something that the underlying wish that the person who has that money is going to determine which direction it moves in. So if you have virtue, that virtue in and of itself is not heading in any particular direction. It requires, much like the money in the hand requires, the money that one has requires an underlying intention or a motivation to push it in one of these three directions that will either then lead me to eat or wear something new or go and watch something. Similarly, whatever virtue or virtuous activity I might accumulate or whatever virtue I might possess, if it's not pushed by a certain aspiration or wish, it doesn't start moving in that direction. And if it is not directed by or motivated by or pushed by the wish to attain liberation, it can't go in that direction. So whatever verbal, physical and mental virtuous activity one accumulates, until it is accompanied with the wish to attain liberation, that virtue doesn't move in that direction. And so because of that, one cannot say there is no pervasion to the syllogism. So one can't say if it is not motivated by the wish to attain liberation, or if it's not motivated by renunciation, it doesn't follow that it is not a cause for liberation. You can't say there's no pervasion to this, because the pervasion is there, because the direction that the virtue moves in, the direction that one's practice moves in, or where it leads to, is entirely determined by the underlying wish that is steering it in a given direction or not.
줍샤주기 개와 약수 진실 샤제 된데디 아니 상기기 고방토베 상기기 사토비 주 딱한다 상기의 귤라 아니 민로데 아니 심진 신라 심진 신 풍부 하마미비 양엘로 군대기 삼바메바도 직 아니 풍부 심진 신 풍부 양엘로 대비 삼바메바다 디체도 풍부 된데기 풍부 하마미비 양엘로 대비 고비체도 응연랑 나랑기 정중군도 지긴 시리봉기 있어야기 삼바 마심비 치를 세게 아니 따도 거야래 따디 따 주버 인소나 아니 계란기 강 사시베 개베사와디 탐지시비 귤을 두고 요 말에 남바 탐지시비 이시주 고방토비 귤을 두고 요 말에 아니 따디 캐바마두 라투에 요 말 당기시야바나시 좀 지고 직사래.
Similarly, whatever activities I am doing, whatever practice I'm doing, is it becoming a cause for attaining Buddhahood? If you give the same reason, so take this activity that I'm doing, it follows it is not a cause for Buddhahood because it is not aimed at enabling others to attain liberation for themselves, and it is not motivated by my own wish to attain Buddhahood, which is a state free of the two obscurations. So if these two wishes, which is one wanting to ensure or lead others to liberation for others, and for oneself to attain a state freed from the afflictions or freed from the obscurations, if these two underlying wishes are not there, then whatever virtue one is accumulating is not going, it is not becoming, is not moving towards Buddhahood. And so, like before, if you cannot say the reason is not established, then one's virtues are not motivated by bodhicitta. And if one virtues are not motivated by bodhicitta, like before, you cannot say there's no pervasion. Because if one's virtuous actions are not motivated by bodhicitta, they are not acting as a cause for attaining Buddhahood. The same reasoning applies here as well.
다 타르바 톰도기 삼바다. 아니야 시행기 되는도 장중무도 시도기 삼바 깨버 이나다. 삼봉도 교버 여버 이나야. 아니 니몽기 자와 시베기 자와 다 풍부 매버 수액이 되버 케윤도 아니 풍부 짐버 책임기 자와디 당진 임바 인도 대당 진당 무수게베 님부지 매버 이나 아니 가리타 쳐버렸으나 아니 랑기 줄라 시베 자와 주베 님부 매버디 타 쳐버다 디 인도다 랑이 추전 송제 nga 추전 타바 미톱데 시베 자와 주베 님부 매비시 따도 그디 따마두 랭자 투구드베 따마두 랭자투는 야고베 따마두 랭자마투나 아니 가리차디요르슬비 시베 자와 주베 님부 요 말다 가실라는 시베 자와 당진의 진능무수기 님부 매로와 님부 매버디 춥데로 따 춥데로 아니 시베 자와 당 진능무수기 님부 매나 람신 가리 곰바 이나야 당진가 투구르베세나 당진가 투구 말해 디 가르치는데잖아 디 김생 가르치려나 디 로이 조다르 로 칸다 칸 임바이나 로 텔라 링일 뒤두고와 친주로기 로다 로 튼튼세야지 로 튼튼세야지도 친주로기 로 세야지 고 로디 그런 조다르와 다 친주로기 로디 컨디션 가구그레슬나 친주로기 로 가단디 친주로기 로디기 강라 신비 유디 오볼라 미네바 통 코니 아니 대가야를 마도 탑 시행기 친주로기 로디 쌍투고 말해 친주로 로디 원도 마주고 삼라 친주로기 로디 매버스여라기 말해 빼나 가지고 이 투고 코소나 당진무도 주고 말해 등 가지고 당진 매버스여라기 말해 당진 쌍바를 라요 말해 당진 매버스고고요나 다음에 통화 코나고네 당진 매버스여 주를 마도 탑 심바 가야요 말해 디 로코랑 로이 조다 김센 텔로고네 배추의 차벽에 체만남들 리위니베 나로라 딜순주 매바니 대봉원이 뉴마이세 송샤바디 데레 다나신기 파바 파발라게 아예 대와나 율라 다면 통는 시베사변 가바 요즈 송고에 nen가디 딜 통거보다 어디인디 따드 투바이나 안타가레 수수결 시베 싸와주주기 님보 메 시베 싸와주주기 님보면은 시베 싸와고도 규규바레 디인디 코발레 타르비 뒤요 말이
So then assume that one has the wish to attain liberation and one also has the wish to benefit others, having correctly identified what the benefit of others is. Even if one has these two, but one doesn't have that mind that perceives an object that is directly contradictory with the object of ignorance. If one doesn't have this mind, which engages in an object which is directly contradictory with the object of ignorance, then one asks oneself and makes the same syllogism and says, take whatever I do or take myself. It follows I cannot remove the root of suffering or the root of samsara, because I don't have a mind that has understood the object of the cause of samsara to be directly contradictory with it. So you haven't cultivated a wisdom that engages in an object that is directly contradictory with the object of ignorance. If you can say the reason is not established, it means that you have cultivated a mind that is perceiving an object that is directly contradictory with ignorance, which is the root of suffering or the root of samsara, then you're fine, then it's great. But if you cannot say that the reason is not established and you don't have a mind, or you haven't understood an object that directly contradicts the way ignorance perceives things, then it's the same reasoning as before. Then there's no way that you have currently accumulated anything, or you have developed an antidote to attaining liberation from samsara. Now the reason for this, if one asks why is it so, then the reason is just because how the mind works. There is no other reason for it. For example, whenever one talks of any kind of cognitive event or a mental state, there's either a mental state that corresponds with reality or engages in something that exists, or there is a mind that is not in accord with reality and is engaging in something that doesn't exist. If it is a mind that is engaging in non-existent, the only way to remove this mind is to understand that the object it engages in doesn't correspond with reality, or to understand that the object it engages in is not existent. So until you can cultivate another mind that perceives something that is directly contradictory with the object of ignorance, you cannot remove it. Temporarily abstaining from cultivating such states, or temporarily not letting them arise within you, is not a sufficient antidote. For instance, when one is in deep sleep, one doesn't have self-grasping or ignorance that is manifest and acting. But just because one is in deep sleep, it doesn't mean that one has cultivated an antidote. So the reason why it is necessary to cultivate such a mind is because that's just how the mind works. If you need to remove a mistaken mind, you need to cultivate a mind that is realizing that what it perceives, what it believes and thinks in, doesn't really exist. With this in mind, this is exactly why Acharya Dharmakirti in the Pramana Vartika says, without removing this object, you cannot, without counteracting or eliminating this object, you cannot remove or you cannot abandon, uproot ignorance. Similarly, Arya Deva says, when you understand reality, then you remove the root of samsara. And so the reason why this is so is because that's just how the mind works, that's just how it is.
So that the Indu, Dewa de lo Dungi Midu say Digi Tarba Druguyovati. Samlo di Drug. And Tarba Druguyo, some of the Kosona, Tarbongo de Shudi Sambatella, Nye Jones. Loading on Shushi Keba in the Nye Jones. The Anna Shingi Shen, Dewa de lo Dungi Midu by Yimbi Chir said Digi Samlo di Tone, and Chanjung on Chanju Druguyovati. The Chanju Druguyovati, two stroop. And Chanjung on the Chindig somebody Kesona, Chanju Sem. Tini Sibizawa down, Zindangus gave a damage to be share up Timena, and Sibizawa German over the tongue you do, and Dindigi, damage to be share up the Guguyova. So the D in do, Tisumbote, Tangazu Musha, Tisumbotel Jerumbuchi, Lambizo number sum session. Tangazu, churching at the Lomniching Ejigi, Miu Mataimbadi, or the Nijung Samba, Chanjuk Sem, Tony Tower, Dindiji the Nijul Kevash. The longa Pejatagin, the Lochutagin, the Lonishutagin, the Kazutagina, Pejata Sasson Sage, married Tagan, the Nijun Chanson Yanda, Tawsum, the Gula, Mageba Kevaji, the Chedi, Matagi music. Matagi music.
So when, now back to that original reason where I want others to be happy and not to suffer within this one single thought, there is, if you understand it correctly, within this thought there is also the wish to attain liberation from oneself. So there is renunciation that is already within it. Similarly, this same thought, when it's understood correctly and cultivated correctly, it also has to be accompanied with the wish to attain Buddhahood, because that's the only state where one can then actually be of benefit to others. And so within this thought itself is also the mind of bodhicitta. Similarly, within the same thought, I wish others to be free from suffering and wish others to be happy, within it is also implicit, or it is already there, that without removing the ignorance which is the cause of staying in suffering, which then needs to be removed by the wisdom that realizes that the object of ignorance doesn't exist, by realizing an object that is in direct contradiction with it. Without having this, it's not possible to do it. Therefore, within the same thought of wanting others to be happy and others to be free from suffering, there is also the wish to cultivate the wisdom that realizes emptiness. So within the single wish of wanting to benefit others, and all these three are already there. That's why Lama Tsongkhapa says that these three, which are renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness, are the three principal aspects of the path. What this means is, whether you're going to study for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, there is no end to studying, or there is no end to reflection until these three have been realized. So as someone who's studying the Dharma and wishes to practice the Dharma, the bare minimum aim that we should have, like the lowest rung that we should aspire to, necessarily is the cultivation of renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wish to realize emptiness, so the development of the wisdom that realizes emptiness. These three are the bare minimum requirements for someone who wishes to engage in practice.
sonzada jizimile rigama deje ani korangi loma sola ta nijungda chanjugi semda tonyi tawala pa goje koala shanlogi logeje pa nijungi sambal go simjele zawa goje ningji chumbu sala chanjugi semgi dus goje simjimang dus mindrogi lamla ya go ba sonza 다 지즈밀레 신된 쇼체버에서 가져다 용락지대지 디체버다.
So that's why Jizu Miller, sitting in that cave up in the mountain, because he was able to ensure that his disciples developed aversion to samsara and desired and wished to attain liberation, therefore cultivated renunciation, he was able to bring forth in them, or have them actualize concern and love and compassion towards other sentient beings, and therefore generate within their mind stream bodhicitta. And he was able to ensure that other sentient beings were able to realize emptiness. And so by doing these three, Jitsun Milarepa was able to bring people onto the path of liberation, onto the path of Buddhahood. That's why he is commonly considered by everyone someone who, while being there, was working for the benefit of all sentient beings in an extraordinary manner.
소산다 좀 된데 다자게 좀 셔져 두바 ngomborzo 상계 사회제라 안 도진할 텐데 손여로 다 도진나로라 아니 코란다 ngomborzo 상계 윤데 아니 게 상계기 규디 가원 고점샤 세제 아니 마때 윤데 아니 장주시도 당보 두께바 디니 고점바디 켄 윤데 아니 코란 당보 두께베 루유드 마 손용 것도 루유드 좀마 손제 아니 딜루유드 제네 아니 준준나로 제수 좀 시발하게 한 대가나 손난기도 치미기우 아니 깨바투마 라곤 제바니 통한남기 디니 팸버스스 디니 치미기우 촌남기 대조 대란유도 톱치스 따간다 치미기부 규르셈베 제라 nga 치미기부디 컨디션 차송서 고점사 마 대용디 아니 당보 투게바 디니는 고잡바디 디니는 고점바디 신기요바인데 아니 깨바투마 라곤 제바 통한남기 디니 팸버스스다 어떤게 상계 고 디니 잠샤스 소자다 상계버 되거든요 창주sem 깨고레스 타르바 되거든요 니중에 삼바 깨고레스 어디 송데 다 딘디싱간주 귤 깨아투 타이르다 미디셈 거다 디케소나 디니모네다 땡게 되고 고츠르다 땡게 되고 고츠르 땡게 긴고 추버레스 당아서 디세고르다.
So our Buddha Shakyamuni, when he, after having attained Buddhahood, when in one sutra he writes, when he reflected on when he first started accumulating the causes, or when he had the first cause, where was that first moment when he first had the cause for attaining this state of Buddhahood? When he looked back at it, he identified that first cause starting from when he generated the mind of enlightenment, so when he first generated bodhicitta. And then accordingly, the Buddha in this sutra, he kind of narrates that episode of how he generated the mind of wanting to benefit other sentient beings. And then similarly, Shantideva in the Bodhicharya Avatara, he writes this verse which says that when the Buddha became a reliable guide, and then the Buddha looked back and he saw the thing that was most beneficial to become a reliable guide for sentient beings, the Buddha saw that what was most beneficial was the mind of compassion, or the mind of bodhicitta. And so, since that is the most precious thing, then that is what should be cultivated. And so then, when Shantideva writes, he says, then therefore strive to attain that. So if the goal is Buddhahood, then one has to cultivate bodhicitta. If the goal is liberation, one has to have renunciation. And so what we need to try and do is we need to try as hard as possible to ensure that we have this, that we can generate this mind in us. And the day that we do have this mind and it becomes something that has arisen inside us, from that day we can be sure that we have started to accumulate the causes for a stable and long-lasting state of happiness.
Dindi samba jula kedinge ani dindi pena chanju gisem chanju ngudu chinde samba jula kedinge chanju gisem jula kedinge tela ani gazeshon bu shiwalage kala semge thamba rinjin de geba thiikula chaselo seje di songdo di nenga bu shudo di.
So that's why Bodhisattva Shantideva, he writes in his text, he writes, I prostrate to those who have generated this kind of mind of bodhicitta within their mind stream. And so it has a lot of meaning when he says that.
There's a mara jigden hamijibe chaja gyur se songyarde. Jigden gelad miyonzo ge chaja wes gyubaresta.
Not only he also writes that such a person who has generated this mind is also worthy of praise and worthy of paying homage to by the gods and all the devas and all of them.
So that di tanganzo miyu tache so. Tanganzo lomni chege miyu khari yimbo sangma chae rewa yoda tangi thanda khazing ni ngad di shudi ngazo miyu dirita. Reso. Ta miyu di yimba yena ta di miyu di yimba yena di drubi tu khadure. Di drubi du thalen re chebre. Jumzen kharchinis labyondi ani chi gen tenjorgi miluda nangi gen gewishinyi gi simbi shi gewishinyi de dembi shis odi tar ko gore ta khanda chinangi genyi de dembe di drubi tu khaduresna chinangi genyi de dembe tu tela drubku ko yorta drugu yuna chinangi genyi changde tu direta ta chi gen di karere chi gen di tenjogi miludire nangi gen di kare nangi gen di dindigi langdurgini 친지 말로버 땡데 경기 신인 탐비기 제수 중에들.
So the reason why I've been saying this for so long is that at least your aim should be clear. Why are we studying? This is why. This is the aim. As to when is the right time to do this, or when is an appropriate moment to do this, the answer is now. The reason why the answer is now is because right now is a moment when each one of us has the external conditions required and the internal conditions required. The external conditions required is a life which is endowed with what we call leisure and opportunity. And the internal cause is that we have met with, or we have in contact with, we are protected, accompanied with, I don't know, like we have with us a spiritual guide. So when the internal conditions and the external conditions come together, and the external conditions are a life of leisure and opportunity, and the internal conditions are the presence of a reliable guide or of a spiritual guide, then when we have the internal external conditions, and we have a moment when these are both present, then that is the right moment, that is an opportune moment for one to start engaging in such practice.
So that chinangi genyi de bitudela drubgore mado. Dende chinangi genyi bodi 양양에 까버려. 디 양조 달린 직보 말이 자마양이 쪽으로 와 삼바이나 디 nye 레라고 요 말이에요. 답변은 시진 된조소로 송바이나 좀 된데게 된조기 밀리생이 nye 하고 쇼레스. 아니 디 빼데 마송 아니 디 된다 닝보디 준준으로 마송 연데 갸조 치린 냐신게 부가르비 준조도 미니신도 톱거 송스. 세지 빼다 자니 마 송용도 대조기 밀루 녀가 송고도 와. 다 디기 녀가와 임비 균생 가르레스 다 꾸용도 저런 부치기 아니 질 밀루 좀 토발라 수림 넘버 다 송고고 요레스 케바르도 대왕계도 저거 수상의 대조기 밀루 세지 모두 제발라 아니 수림 넘버 다 시송 짐발라 소보 troche 아니 melon timamebe 양네 양도 삼자와지 구구 여바 인디 규태다부 주베 신도 권베 체로 김진디 거기도 와 따다 루도 김진디.
So when you have these two conditions and when these have been met and fulfilled, then that is the right moment to do it. Why? Because you won't get them again. So if you think, well, I have them now, I might have them again, so I can do it later, I can put it off to another moment, the answer is no. Or what the Buddha says is it's not possible. It's very difficult that you'll get them again. And so with respect to the external conditions, which are a life of leisure and opportunity, the Buddha has said that it is extremely rare to find it, based on which then Shantideva gives that analogy of it like a blind tortoise in an ocean that every 100 years or so pops its head up and is trying to stick it in a floating yoke. That's how rare it is. And if you ask why is it so rare or why is it so difficult, it's because just to attain a favorable human body, or just to attain a human body, one needs to have practiced pure conduct or pure ethical conduct. But just a human body is not sufficient. Here we're talking about a human life that is endowed with leisure and opportunity. So it has to be supported by the 4 kinds of pure conduct, which is then coupled with the practice of generosity. It is coupled with the aspiration and the prayer to attain such a state. And so for all of these conditions to come together and give rise to the state of leisure and opportunity is extremely rare. That is why Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim Chenmo, he says it is extremely rare that you will find such a state, because to get it you need to be supported by all of these things, and being supported by all of these things itself is very rare.
기비신이 세야지 신도네냐 제가와르스 뒤좀된디 도도 유대 망분이 송고요 봐. 뒤 김생 가르치는 나나 아니 라보스um 유고는 단기 제롬부지 송원나 신시제 라보스um 유고는 규들로 친지 말로바 셰데 행기 강사 잠불링 디날 가서 요레스라다 다 신도네 꼼보로다 셰라기 꼼보로 봐. 뒤 덴디지 나로네 소소리 녀구고 요바인데 아니 시오지게 녀가와르스 뒤송고르다.
Further, as far as the spiritual guide, which is the internal condition that is required, even that is extremely rare, and that has also been said by the Buddha in the sutras. And if you ask why is it extremely rare, like Lama Tsongkhapa said earlier, for a bare minimum, at the bare minimum, one needs someone who has completely kind of tamed their mind through the practice of the 3 turnings. That in itself is extremely rare. And so if you consider how many people exist on our planet who have this quality of having tamed their mind through the practice of the 3 turnings, it's quite self-evident how rare and difficult it is to come across someone like that.
sonza digi chinangi ken nibodi yang nyekawa sonza ani tythane nyebadi chususumendrowa ani digangla drubse samba deji ketoba yena tinju chususumendrowa tinju nyeka se dig nyamne tuguyorta.
So if one is able to understand this and one is aware of the rarity of the situation that one has and the preciousness of it, then with that kind of certitude that this is an extremely rare opportunity which is not going to come again, if one then engages in actions that ensure that we're making the best use of it without letting it go to waste, then that is the practice or the realization of this life being a life endowed with leisure and opportunity.
다 최주벌 친한게 깽이다 덴베 덴데기 르든 사숑부지 단다 여르데 이나 텔라케민도 단다당아 쉔쉔인 삼바 단다당아 시르메 삼바가도 삼로지 여르데 디 삼로디 농주리에스 잠블링비 셀라 찌링 예바메바 아니 다 하버도 니둥기 셀라 대외적 예바메데바 다디 미답에 돌아서 되는 망부 쇼주디 송만나시 말아서 무슨 통주 퇴주여 되바 들어와 어디인데 남친 예메세스 다 남친 예메세 송시아바 디기 치위 뒤 예바메바 송자 아니 최주벌라 롱예 삼바 디왕도 당시 아니 슈슈샤바이나 digimebadi and chiwamedaba digi samud yunguyarta.
So, if one then appreciates or is mindful of the fact that one has this state of leisure and opportunity, but then one thinks, well, I have time because I'm still young and I have many years to follow, then this is not an accurate thought, it's not a correct thought. And the reason why this is not an accurate thought is because there is no guarantee that this life is going to not end now. So there is no certainty to when this life will end. The conditions for this life ceasing are multiple, are manifold. And so then there are many sutras where the Buddha talks about death and impermanence. And the reason for that is because the notion that we are currently in a state where we have a lot of time, where we can put this off for the time being and do it later, is a mistaken thought because there is no guarantee to when one will die. And the fact that this is the case is evident from just observing other people and how the world works. And so with that in mind, by generating the realization of the imminence of death and impermanence, along with the lack of guarantee or the non-certitude or the non-definitiveness of when it arises, then that is the practice of death and impermanence.
Tangi jun changse yangde ta digsuwa samlo dangdangdi. Tangi jun changse yangde tawa sombo di gyula magi dibaro di chiwa lobur di chung suwa ta kachi gore. Ani chima nge suwa migebe dingsuwa ayo sosola. Nga chuji chima nge suwa kenge mayinde, chima nge suwa kenge mayi bi gyumsindila nga ta dindi chi kuya yo se sosola dingsuwa ki ta chi kuya yo na digi yor. Dindi dingsuwa ki ta chi kuya me na ani kyab tsuyo gore ta. Chima nge suwa migebe tadi chi che gu yor. Di indi ani jirumba chegi lamrim ta nyamguru nang songa na shishini shini ngendro miki ding me jings. Ani shini ngendro miki ding meba indi ta chiwa lubur du papsana nyasondo miki we chabjik tsuyo gor tandani tradishini shagugu yoba indi ani kunjo sumle sabe ta kyabjik su yore. Di indi di jikjo kunjo sumdo nges. Di indi kunjo sumbo tela nying tabani ani kyabsun rawashik. Kyamrugi nyamne du gotsam gore. 그래서 다 겹수 주면 고바디 겹수 드레체 아니 디 랍잘 겹르기 랍잘 랍고를 마도 겹수 주는 랍잘 말라는 핑기 메르바 디 인디 겹수 주면 랍잘 dinzo를 냠바메 바시 랍고 그래 겹르기 랍잘 망고 여베 나로니 싸와 투사 잡으디 까나 렌딩이 부들 투고 여바 인디 아니 랑도 수진 벨 라레소 세지 저런 것이 송샤바디 아니 겹르기 냠니 디가도 스pon거다.
So if one has this life endowed with leisure and opportunity, and it is true that death is uncertain and can happen at any point, then what if one doesn't take advantage or doesn't put to practice or put to use this life endowed with leisure and opportunity, and suddenly one dies? Does one feel like we're certain that we will not have an inferior rebirth? And so at that point one needs to try and give oneself a reason. I will not take an inferior rebirth. Do you have a reason that is a valid reason for proving that you will not take an inferior rebirth? Because if you don't, and it's possible that before you can make use of this life, you might suddenly die, then you need to ensure that you're doing something to not let that happen. And so that's why the next step that is discussed, or the next stage that is brought about, is refuge. And so you seek an object of refuge or someone that can protect you from a state of an inferior rebirth. And so that's why in his Songs of Experience, Lama Tsongkhapa writes, not having the certainty that that I will not take an inferior rebirth, at that point with complete conviction in an object of refuge, one has to take refuge. Now taking refuge is not enough, one has to also cultivate or listen and implement the advice that is given by the person that one takes refuge in. And so since there is no refuge that is superior to the three jewels, then one takes refuge in the three jewels, but not just by taking refuge, but by implementing the advice that they have given. And the basic advice that is being given to ensure that one doesn't take inferior rebirths is the realization of what is called white and black, or virtuous and non-virtuous karma, so abstaining from non-virtuous actions and cultivating virtuous actions. And so then that's why Lama Tsongkhapa writes, and therefore certitude in object of refuge, and then certitude in the practice of karma is the practice that is required over here.
다 남치 녜메 임보 송자 치워 로브르도 옹시 바지레 치워 로브르도 밥소나 되니 니중 찬서 양도 따와 귤라 결론 게 고급지 마셔 보시 시고 총소나 다 자와 잡서디 깨와 치모모도 매르와 디인도 다 치모를 양결 텐조기 치긴 텐조도 남기긴 신이 답이 심버지 구구 요바인데 한 단기 공도 저런부지 송고 나신제제 텐조기 밀리 캐버진 토비 규텔라 아니 melom timami samjawaji gugu yore songyo sonsa nyiri shindu chima laryan tenjogi chinangi gengi de dembe dendegi tuji kokabji chungegi ta melom gyen gugu yore.
And so since it is possible that death can come at any given moment, and it is also possible that we will not be able to make the best use of this life of leisure and opportunity because death can come at any moment, if that does happen, and that is the situation that one finds oneself in, then the only kind of hope that one has is to be able to carry on practicing or do it next time around. And to be able to do it next time around, it's not sufficient that one has any kind of birth, but one has again a birth that is again endowed with leisure and opportunity. And so because one needs then in the next time, in the next life around, one also needs external and internal conditions that are favorable, like Lama Tsongkhapa earlier had said, where one needs to accumulate the causes for that, amongst which there is the aspiration and prayer to be in such a state or to attain such a state. It is essential, and it is also fundamental that from now one makes such an aspiration and such prayers repeatedly, because it acts as a cause to ensure that the next time around one has a similar condition to continue practicing.
손자다 덴데기 지난기 gen기데 dengi molom지 갸고고 요바인데 아니 단도 군진 롱지람 점게 몰람 덴디지 송여래 강도 개비 깨와 탐지도 토리 연된 든든 터버셔스 텐주기 밀루터베디 몰람 경고다 강도 개비 깨와 탐지도 토리 연된 든든 터버셔스 깨만 타도 최다 체결지스 수진 루베 라완 요버셔스 대한 라만 탐바 니신이 닌데 센도 철로 줘버셔스 세디 신년 탐바 제수송 얘기 몰람디 경고다 대한 라만 탐바 니신이 닌데 센도 철로 줘버셔 최도 내내 최톱니 가르쳐 최도 내내 닝부 텐도 세드 시비 점도 개버셨어 다 최톱니 닝부 텐 가르두고 니준 선생 양들 따와서 모두 주제 아니 랑시비 점도를 개야 신시비 점도를 개버쳐야 돼 어디디 가서 melom timami samjar said di yana yang to samjar chiga gu yorta.
So then, since we need to make these aspirations, one such aspiration by Kungkhen Lodje Rabjampa is, he says, may I be born again endowed with leisure and opportunity, and from the very moment that I am born, may I be endowed with the autonomy or the freedom to be able to practice. And by coming into contact immediately with the Dharma and having the freedom to practice, may I come in contact with the perfect guide. And with this, may I practice the Dharma all day and all night. And when I have now attained such a state of perfect leisure and opportunity, what do I do with it? May I attain the three, renunciation, bodhicitta, and the wisdom of emptiness, through which may I be able to be freed from the ocean of cyclic existence, and may I be able to free other sentient beings from cyclic existence. And so this kind of aspiration one needs to do it again and again.
강도 gibi 개와 탐지도 토리 연된 둔된 토버쇼스 토리 연된 둔된 덴버 토버쇼스 연된 둔이 가르송 걸라나 대당 수dim동라 공바다 퇴비 규절 체용 어사시 셰라 푸순서버 노르딘보스 어디 대당 수dim 동라 공바다 진바시 대다 수dim 동라 공바다 퇴비 규절 대당 수dim 동와 동심 대다 수dim 대도 수림동라 공부하다. 니 퇴배 규절. 퇴배 규절. 체유 뭐자 셔봐. 아니 셔럽. 어디 노르딘도 송거래. 대도 수림동라 공부하다. 퇴배 규절. 아니 체유 뭐자 셔럽 부숨 속아. 심규 토야. 졸려. 응. 다 당부 아주 퇴바 체지 심규 시시도 왜 차야 돼. 퇴다 시시둘 세죠. 어디?
아니 DJ lage
Tubi Gudu, Teo Mozashi, Teo Mozasheva. In Sherapusum so Odisungurta. Turi Yundin Dunesna Tisegos.
So in this aspiration, Longsher Abjam, he writes that we need 7 qualities for the state, endowed with leisure and opportunity, but with 7 qualities. And these 7 qualities are one is happy, one has perfect ethical conduct, one has the wish to engage in generosity, the wish to give, one can hear. Through what one hears, then one can tame one's mind. One has also, I don't know the right word, but like not really shame, but one is kind of self-aware and one is aware of one's own shortcomings and one is willing to accept them. And that one then has also pure wisdom. So these 7 are the 7 states that Longchen Rabjam writes are characterized, the 7 states that characterize such leisure and opportunity that one should attain.
Dire. Sonzan da Chimala Layan Tenjo dan, Shinyan Tambegi, Jesus Sungegi Chedo, Ani Gu, da Labgoya, Gula Labgoya Che, da Teda Nyamdo, Chima Mikumbi Nesu Kebra Chinegi, Gu Yorba, da Ana Jigi Chimala Shinyan da Kateduegi, Gu Yore, Dela de Gazo Lidip said the Sungu Yore, Diyundi, and Jerumuchegi Lani Yangun so on Nashin Cheje, Tobji Sango Shagwache Guresta. Kabar lidip jonga ne chebe se songrwa sonza de yin gosum digdung timen baba da ani gosum digdung timen baba sha kabar legi diba jonga di shindu ne chewares de yin nyimbu tobje gone shagwa che gure se an di paru de la ani ngarji gi lela gyo semche ani janju gi semda kamru gi system bache ngarji gi lela gyoba di nyimbu kundu chebe kasa number sunjimbe top dirwa Dini Kamdo da Chanjuki Sim Bache, Titenge Topche, Ani Nyembo Tela, da Diba Korangi Kadu, Lake Diba Korangi Kadu Nyembo Tela, Deni Dijinshebe Saint Joya, Deni Sunga Joya, Chamba the Ninja Gomia, that Chanju Labor to Chanjuki Sem Gomia, Dinzo, Kadu Koran, Nyembo Gundu Chebe Topro, Tony Gomia Dinzo, and Chima Dom Sem Kandar, Nyembo Toshi Gone, Shabache. Tadi Gajin Diba Jong Set. 다 가진 디바 종와도 찹직도 퉁진 초 사고고 여바 윤디 아니 야나 다 샤베 야나 데파 비베 셴바 야나 데주고네 소남고 초초사 도시제 디바로델라 디바샤야 가진 디바 종야 아니 퉁진 야나 둥기고 초사야 어디 냠네 두슬레로스타.
So since one needs to ensure that one is practicing now, but while one is also engaging in the practices now, one needs to ensure that one will not take an inferior birth. And along with not taking an inferior birth, one also needs to ensure that one will not be separated from the spiritual guide, where the obstacle to not being separated from a spiritual guide, or what leads one to be separated from a spiritual guide, is known as the karmic obscurations. To counter this or to purify this, there is the practice of confession through the 4 powers. What are they called? 4 opponent powers. Yeah, I don't know that translated. Do you know them? How are they? Regret, reliance, resolve, and? Sorry? Remedy. Okay. So then the purification of one's karmic obscurations through confession, that is, however, a confession that is complete because it has the 4 opposing powers. And so once one has this, this is included within the removal or the purification of obstacles or opposing conditions. And so this is done with the intention or with the aim of removing or purifying obstacles, along with which then one also needs to accumulate the virtuous actions. And so this is the 7-fold, so the 7 limbs, then there is the accumulation of virtue, and then through this way there is the purification of the obstacles. And so when these 2 are coupled together, then these are the kind of practices that are suggested or are done repeatedly, because that's the aim or that's the goal that one wishes to get to.
Tadi tanda lojong tundibi nanglola tangbo ngondro thala lapse songdeyagi ta dire ta dila ngazo namjo yongragi songdeya dela tumongchi ngondro sechi 다간다 인샤 트위지라 냠린 칸데지 무시 냠린 칸데지 고츠고요나 단계 고니 슈보데 송데디 아니 섬을 똥고고요다 어디래.
So in the 7 verses of mind training, when it says practice or cultivate the preliminary practices, these are the preliminary practices that one has to engage in. And so whatever activity one does, whatever practice one does, it has to be preceded by, or it should be preceded by, a complete reflection of this. And so to go through each one of these as a preliminary before one engages in whatever dharma practice is a necessary kind of habit that one should try and cultivate and perform again and again repeatedly.
So that the 단다 림바 가정니에 지네마도 당보 따지 꾀제 ngajuju chödugo de dewadolo dungemi de bichirse samodana dindeji gone madu gongba shedan di tanda pangrimdo masun gongba shedan di suwabodi jerumba chere chege lani chumonal songdowa o diinde tidan dene do shin samlo tangba yina ta kandar debu shujuyorta sonza ngushi nyamlen khadi chigine di ngundu gozudan da bodela 당고 수도 스마 땡간도 대사와다 ngachuji chö 가르친 루고래 당고 지와야 땅 안 디랜드라 ngachuji chö 루고도 대완들로 동에 미드 비치르스 안 대와들로 동에 미드 비치르스 라윤데 nga 대와 가리 되기도 동에 가리 되고 민도스 대와도 동에 근지 지당 타라들로 공부도 시 계시 된데 힘이 있나 안 대다되는 chö 최고도 세 가리 가리랬어 chö 고와도 차바세 되니 심진 시행 대화되고도 동에 미드 바로 봐 디인데 아니 대라 가르쳐 버렸어 어 대라야 아니 시행이 되는 장중모도 최고야 또 공부되니 꿀롱 쥐다니 타바 뒤니기 꿀롱 쥐다다 장주 뒤니기 꿀롱 쥐다 도 제제마 대체 아니 디기 지심에 돈에 아니 깜로도 제니 아니 단계 시에대게 림바딘도 차상지마도 제제 또 공부지 시에니 따디 고 주제직니 가지고 고르기는 디도 공부 시에바 있나 따디 인간주 인샤 트위직라 니마 차진 제고에 냠린들다디 따디 자원인 유게메 따디 백해 전부 차기가
So from the first day when we started talking about this original syllogism is I need to practice the dharma because I want to be happy or not be sad, and then all of the things that have kind of come out of this original syllogism or this original reason, the entire order or the progression that I have shared is very much in line with how it is presented by Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim. And if one kind of goes through this process in this way, it's very well structured and very well ordered, and it's very easy to kind of follow and recollect. So from the moment that one sits down every morning or whenever one does, to go through one's session or to go through one's practice, if one starts off by asking oneself or giving this reason of saying, I should practice the Dharma because I want to be happy and not suffer, then it immediately leads to a good recognition of what happiness is, what suffering is, how to overcome it, what is the Dharma that needs to be practiced to attain it, is what I'm doing tying up with this, and then what about others? Do they also need to be happy and not suffer? Is that something that I need to do? How do I do it? What do I need to be able to do that? And so then the wish not just to attain liberation for oneself, but Buddhahood, because it is the only state for the benefit of others. And then have this become your motivation, where the motivation for attaining liberation is renunciation, the motivation for attaining Buddhahood is then bodhicitta. This cultivation and doing this regularly is something that one should be able to do every day. With this kind of then underlying intention, when one takes refuge or whatever other practices one does, whether this initial preliminary kind of reflection takes an hour or however long it takes, is something that one should do regularly on a daily basis before engaging in any kind of practice.
드몬치 용으로 냠내듯이 대단 제네스나 디젤라 땅아다 제네 용구여서 간다 디젤라 투모마이 바 문도텔라 라메네 조르세지 젤라비 자와 라마세지 라메네 조기 냠내지 용구여서 다 디믹스에 단다 디 슈에게메 제마제만 가도 지시는 계좌 용식이래 다 간다 이내 단다 쉐데 투몬치 용으로 시도와 다 딩간조 퇴바다 상바도 공부 관계 내가라요 원도 drogo야 디 인심이지 원도 drogo야 디 티르다.
So since these are the common preliminary practices, they need to be, they need to precede whatever practice one does. Then when one talks about the uncommon preliminaries, then one is referring primarily to tantric practice, where then the uncommon preliminaries are guru yoga and other things which right now there's no point, it's not the right moment to talk about it. So here, when we've just discussed all of these other things as preliminary practices that are common preliminary practices, they are something that should be cultivated prior to whatever one does or whatever one activity one engages in or whatever dharma practice one does.
또 지당이 람림 나로라 당보 신이 되니 텐조니아가 치와미다 레준도 코웨니미스 도스마 방림도 시제고 람게지만 냠네 셔다지 용거요래 이나 단다데 당보 딘시고지 춘루고데 춘루고그래 김생 가지는 대화들 동음이 주셔서 저런부시기 텐조니아가 가돌로 그 수르점시 텐조니아가 가돌도 수르도 지금 송요르디 춘루고봐 춘루브너봐 아니 춘루비 뒤카디바 봐. 안 다단이네 죽고야. 어딘데 김진 리리리 거예요. 어디 도시는 당고 공부도 시해버이나. 디 공부도 시해버이나. 야구를 주었다. 나랑라 디펜도 시해라. 또 도시제. 단다 단기 휴번하신 도시제. 춘 죽고야 되지. 아니 주비트디 가드레스는 다다리도 세. 그봐. 안 도대던 제네 아니 소사야나 디비전 단기고 시해도 시마딜레요. 다 딜레 세비제들라. 아니 투몽용으로 투몽만 이명으로 라멘네조 스테인데 디바로데니 라멘네조 디아주 아니 디카드들 신이도 주 공부도 시 루시에바이나 고도 체제고 방림지 다 두신 로디요다.
So even though the Lamrim has an order which is relying on a spiritual guide, death and impermanence, and then it has its own order, in the section where Lama Tsongkhapa talks about leisure and opportunity, he just kind of briefly mentions this syllogism, or this reason that we gave about why I should practice, is it appropriate to practice, when to practice, how to practice. So for me personally, I find this to be more helpful, where even though the Lamrim has this kind of order, before getting into it, I start with giving myself this reason of I need to practice the Dharma because I wish to be happy and not be happy. And then from the understanding of what being happy and not suffering means, then what practicing the Dharma means, and then the entire order that I have shared, then I go through the entire structure, and after having completed the common preliminaries, then there are the uncommon preliminaries which are Guru Yoga, and so then I go through that. And then by going through this again and again every day, I find this to be extremely helpful. So this is kind of how I go about doing it, and I find it to be particularly helpful.
학벌도 딘시디 대원들로 동의민도 비치세기 딘시디 공부해야 돼. 딘시디는 캬바도 공부해야 돼. 편도 충분하다.
Especially with this reason, the original syllogism that I gave, when I give it to myself and then I reflect on the reason and then the pervasion between the reason and the predicate, and I kind of structure my practice or base it around this syllogism, I find that to be particularly beneficial.
배나 심정이 된 제고 그래 시생이 된 제고 그래 김생 가진라는 시엔 대화들로 동의민도 비치를 따고 용데 아니 시엔 대화들로 동의민도 바 이능이 가르친 심정이 된 제고래 세게 지와들 레병으로 왕가절 랑슈기 지월레 연데 그냥 공부지 써먹던 거 치기로 와 아니 준준낭로라 다기 신기 동의셀 동의 인실 다독신 딘스고 용도 와 나초진 신기 동의 세고데 아니 시행기 동의디 동의이 미셔스 빼나 랑기 동의신스 단지고도 다기 시행기 동의세 동의이지 다독신스 다기 시행은 편벌자 심진이지 달류신스 딘지도 거용도 소자다 딘주 상마 사모다에 고급라기도 디 소자디 대화들 동의미디 딘지디 치라기 뉴베침버레 빼차셔나다 걔나도 디나로 망쳐와 롭종용이 장냐로와 톨롭dim용이 장냐로와 롭종 dim여로 딩디기 롭종 dim여로 딩디기 롭종 가르친치 딘지 죽고실라나 그거 지그러와 대화 동의 미디비 투사들다 아 디나로 총례 징에 연에 총 가르친 잡이 있을라나 대화들 동의 미디비 그애들에 한 창사 양이 창사 야상에 있는 창사 가르친 게 있을라나 대화들 동의 미디비 싫어 딱 한다 대화들 동의 미디비서도 직 제대로 버다 대화 될 동에 믿으비 싫으세 딘지디 손자 대화 될 동에 믿으버 손자 니 로존지 제바 인스타 로존 디기 대화 두고 요래 동 로존 디기 대화 두고 요래 동에 세 두고 요래 삼로 디기 돈에 로존 디 제로다 다 로존 디기 대화 가가서 두고 동에 가가서 세 두고도 아니 민수여바 민 가진 수고요 대화 될 동에 믿으비 싫어 워낙 민수여바 디기 대화 가지시 두고도 동에 가지시 세 두고도 창사기와 디기 대화 가지시 두고 동에 가지시 세 두고도 가루 지고 디기 대화 가지시 두고 동에 가지시 세 두고도 소도 도구스마 지왔다나 타마델라 대화 주버도 동에서와 담배치 코나라 라레비 체르를 세기 최근 건지 디가 딱다 아마 밥이 그랬다 딘시 코와티 셴바 창마 딘 가르소 그런 가서 이지게를 마서는 페일 차로 그러다 대화 주버도 동에 된 대화 되버도 동에 메드베 코든 토네 디 제가 제레데 디기 대화 주버라 그 사스 차 두고 메르 동에 세기 딱다 제 두고 메르 다디 제마토디 밥사 가와 밥기르스나 대화 주버도 동에 세워도 담배치 코나라 라리기도 세기 쇼기 가나도 스코라게 디기 톤네 땅을 취마도 가리도 세기 깨져들래 윤데 아니 최소체 은 셴바 지den기 차와든서 샤다 쇼라세 샤르중세 차봤다 소소 코디 로주엘라 디 딘시디 샤라기 누버 첨부르시디
So this reason, especially the reason, whenever I kind of go through the reason, it gives a lot of room for thought or a lot of food for thought, because, for example, with the reason of wanting to benefit others, I have to benefit others because others wish to be happy and others don't wish to suffer. When I think of the pervasion, a doubt that often comes up is, well, if others wish to be happy and don't wish to suffer, why do I have to practice? Or why do I have to do something about it? And so when these kind of doubts arise, then they give you room, or they give you kind of something to reflect on further about strengthening your resolve for doing it. And so, for instance, Shantideva in his text, in the Bodhicharyavatara, he writes, it gives a syllogism to show why I need to work for the benefit of others. And he says, the suffering of others has to be removed by me because it is suffering. And he gives, for example, my own suffering. And so, when you reflect on the reason or the syllogism and you're thinking about the reason and the pervasion and you complement it with other reasons that have been given in the text to kind of further strengthen one's resolve and the conviction and the necessity of it, then it becomes a very potent kind of driving force or something that really steers your practice forward. For example, everything that we've done, all of you over here are all people who studied and you've gone through, you've completed your education and you've done a lot of things. And whatever we do in life is generally with the sole intention of being happy and not suffering. So if I was to ask you, or if you were to ask yourself and say, why have you done this? Why have you studied so much? Or why have you engaged in this profession? Or why do you pursue this profession? If you are a businessman or a businesswoman, if you say, why are you doing this? Or you've gotten married, then why did you get married? Or if you are in a relationship, why are you in this relationship? Eventually, at the end of the day, what it always will boil down to is because I wish to be happy and I don't wish to suffer. So whether it is for wealth or whether it is for fame or reputation or whatever it might be, the reason that we pursue any activity is with the wish to be happy and not to suffer. And so if that is the thing that we think about and that is our driving goal and that is the reason that we eventually find ourselves giving for whatever activity we engage in, when we check how much each of our activities has been successful in leading to that happiness and leading to that elimination of suffering, we notice that most of what we do fails in leading to that outcome. And so when we sit and we think about this again and we reflect on it again and again, then we come to that certainty that the genuine happiness and the complete freedom of suffering is only attainable by the practice of dharma. So this is not something that one starts with, but it is something that one ends up with when one goes through and kind of puts to test everything that we do and all the expectations we have from all the other things that we have done up until now and all the plans and hopes that we make. So has become famous, how happy has that made you? Has been wealthy, how happy has that made you? How happy has your marriage made you? How happy has your relationship made you? Whatever it might be. And if you come to the conviction that these are not really successful in leading to this final goal, then that certainty that the Dharma is the only option that can lead to that goal gets reinforced. As a result of which then practicing the Dharma takes precedence or takes center stage, and that becomes one's main objective. And then all the other things that one can do in life, one carries on doing them, but they're kind of on the side. They're not the primary activity that one is engaged in. So this syllogism, starting out with this original syllogism or reason, is very powerful. Okay. So we were discussing earlier, there were some suggestions that have come. I won't read the whole thing because they're a little bit long, but just kind of summarizing them. Together there's about 6. So the first one, which is common to both, was the one to do a debate in the afternoons. And this was common to both of these suggestions. And there was a list of benefits. So that was one. So since the first suggestion came up from the students yourselves, which was actually very good, so thank you for having come up with that suggestion. I think it's a great suggestion of doing debate also in the afternoon. And because this has come up from the students themselves, it's actually very helpful and it's a good idea to do it. So starting from tomorrow, on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday and Friday, we can do debate in the afternoons from 3:30 to 4:30, 1 hour. We'll do group pair debate, we'll do debates in pairs on every day, except Wednesday, when Sagurumuchi will come down. And we'll do it from 3:30 to 4:30, 1 hour afternoon debate in pairs every day. So from tomorrow, we'll start with this. Then the other one was, if we can do before each class or before each session, a few minutes of meditation, or meditation to kind of set the motivation or reflect on the context of what we're going to do.
Gom jayadirwa. Ta goma chungono gom jayadi kulun chue da dindiki gom chigi yoro tangi nga zu shudiyagi. Dinzu shoge suzu sha nalo gom jana peya kordi. Di shoge suzu sha nalo la tangi lawa nashi nga di karchiga lere, nga di chegoya karire se, di dinzu samoda jani suzu dinzi goye che, du gongba sheni kulun chue goye tsama chue che, di tuzu mabu gogo, tuzu tungtung nalo kulun chue di yagu yungu maare. Di indi ko sha nalo la kulun chue dinzu sama yagu ujin samlo tang, di debi tuba che. Tang nguishi di zinda na le yundi, nganzo ta zinda goma zu kong la, kama nga ringa gomji keje shigi yoba yundi, ta nganzo di shego orwa, samlo tongya ji gozu gu yoba yundi, ngoy la samlo tongya di sem, nganzo, sem lhulu debashi gugu yorata, nganzo sem shihon debashi gugu yorata. De zinda na lewe kadu de la sem chuk deba dragu dang, yang samlo shenpa la kor deba so dragu dang, dende che deba ina, ko kadu de la lobzhong gozu guba ina, ko gejenji chagi yoba yundi, ane dende ki matu ye che do, sem shihon ye che do, yakshu du kare resi na uju mudare. Di indi, kama nga ringa zinda go mazu kong la, su zo lungi nenjor slabgirin kandara, lung zhong la mikba te che, kama nga si de tuba ina, digi ko sem gi shomba lung yindu, lung shi na sem, lung tu na sem tu slaba songzang, ko sem de madu she che ko hlue pabu ji yungu yorda. Hlue pabu ji le yindu, ani 대단 제네 고아엔 사모다에 고소인데 야구여. 디 검자시는 맞고요.
So there's the meditation or the reflections, which is like the motivation that you set for engaging in the study or in any activity. And so since it's a longer thing, like we've discussed, and that's something that is not going to really be effective if you just sit down and run through the motions in just 5 minutes, it would be perfect or ideal if you did that in your room every morning. And so every morning, if you could set out starting like we've been discussing and go through this entire process, then it'll really set the day in the right frame, and also then everything that you do during the course of the day, it'll kind of fall in line with why. And so it's a good thing to maybe do. So that, because it's going to take a little bit longer, I mean not a little bit, it'll take longer than just 5 minutes, it's more effective and beneficial if you do that every morning in your own room before we come. But before we start, when we come to this, because we were talking about doing maybe a short meditation before the class itself starts, since when you start studying something, your mind should be technically calm or not distracted or not agitated, it would be helpful, it could be helpful if we did a little bit of that breathing meditation where we just focus on the breath for about 5 minutes before we start. And the reason for that is, since the mind and the breath, they go together and the mind kind of rides the breath, if we can kind of bring our breath down and stabilize it and calm it, and then we can start the class and we start to think with that kind of mind space or that kind of calm state, then that will be particularly helpful. So from tomorrow before the sessions, it's a good idea maybe to implement this and do like a short 5-minute meditation, but each one individually just focus on the breath as an object, and through that breathing meditation, then we can kind of center ourselves and bring our minds stable before we start the class. That will be particularly beneficial. So there's this one which is, since the stages of the path are particularly helpful or beneficial, instead of keeping it for the 4th year, wouldn't it be helpful if we could maybe bring it on now every now and then?
Ta lo shiba la ta nga zo danda paru la da rimbuji phego re ngai de to samsam yong du di paru la nga zo lam gi rimba dige de zo test 20 gre ina lo shiba la nga zo tia zo di changju sembe ge tene sai yende de zo geje shigo de ne sai yende geje ma shi ngon la ani 닝지 심보 토다 파송도 계층부 인다 닝지 심보 때네 아니 장주 sembo 중당 장주 sembo를 상게를 아니 예랑라 소바다 간지 탐 디기 탐지 자와 소로 지제 디간들 잠닝지 장주기 셈 깨다다 디 거체 안 디니네 아니 장주 sembe게 연대도 사이 연대도 마다 도도도도도도시는 마 티에레 디 탄다 개보신 탄다디 셰기 되나 거기 고갑도 대시 데마 차바서로시도 그 바로 두두두두두 가지고 단다 20
So the kind of discussion about the stages of the path and how to move around it is something that while Rinpoche is coming in these days and while I come, we'll briefly be touching upon it. It's not something that we're not going to be touching upon. But when we're talking about the material for the 4th year, we're talking about the qualities or the characteristics of all the bodhisattva stages. And so when we're talking about the stages that the bodhisattvas have to go through, the paths of the bodhisattvas, then it's important to have kind of understood what compassion is, what love is, what loving kindness is, what compassion is, and having a good understanding of these, and how when you cultivate this, these progress and get progressively stronger and they get enriched with various qualities. And so then you start talking about the stages of how this original state of mind gets embellished with these qualities which lead to Buddhahood. And so since the discussion is a little more kind of elaborate and a little more whole, rounded than just a short presentation, trying to go about it in the beginning already from now might not be the best option. And so we keep it for the 4th year as far as the subject matter goes. But a general presentation of how the path follows and what comes next and what comes first is something that will keep coming up already from now.
당간주 labradigi miyudi ngazu khajin phiyunal tiyore kanda number 12 lamgi ngo manoro lamgi korim matruba ngode chedi ta ngazu gi miyudirta de ta korim laedi ngelo ngo manowo de thangbo tenla maphamna rimbegeje shesa yo marwa odi de ta tanda lo thangbo da niba da dikha lo thangbo khadu la ngazu lamgi ngo tembe sugu yorda lamgi ngo tembe che yonde ngo tenla phabe chobdi kharilana tangi shuedi nijungi samba mena tarbil lamla mindoya 장주기 셈매나 남진이 줄라 민도야 동이기 따와면은 시베자와 주미도야 코 남기 고 카리 임바디 디 템베비 케시슈 임바인디 로지모 로젠낭로라 템 남디 리브니 템바시드 제니 디 차상질레 응그와 소자다 디 카돌라 아니 치루바게 낭바마 임베 셴바수에게 간다 tarbi gyug nguzi che dang dinzo kante kante yime, di norgyu kante shagi yume, ten dinzo namsha gyaba di nga zo lo jama ligi ruwa. Ta lo sumbayi ki lopchen zowo di nga zo dekhona nye sheye dirwa, tongba nye di. Sonza ta tongba nye di sibe zawa ki nga ki nyingbo zi gomaya di tongba nye chagi yoba yindi, tongba nye ki kowa di nor sona lamgi ngo kora nor sawa ruwa. Ani kale khazi gyana ko pecho me ruwa. Di tongba nye ki kowa manawa zi gugu yoba yindi, di lo sumbala nga zo labgi yorwa. 디제 디 로시발레 윤디 디 람기 림발 딕체 다 림바마 딕체 냠네치다 다 단기 고 림바징이 슈버레 디 낭시 림바 고가조 갈레 도시지 뭐땅 아주 단다 닝보디 제마 캐나조 로시 디니 퇴 용디 간다 람기 고 만으로 신기 람기 고림 마축 뭐 하고 그였다 땅 냠네체 마지 소소라고 인다 세지 아주 어디 라고 지데니 샤 단다도도 비샤 도도지 라고 샤한다 표시 체마지 캐나조 라고 인사 미디 타 접스.
So, like we've written and was kind of, I guess, communicated right in the beginning, the aim of setting up this course was to ensure that you have a correct understanding of what the path is and a correct understanding or a non-mistaken understanding of how to go along this path. So the order, what the path is and the order of the path, a correct understanding of the path and the order in which the path progresses. And so, when one talks about the path and what the correct path is, like we've said, if you want to attain liberation, it's renunciation. If you want to attain Buddhahood, it's bodhicitta. And then, through this, to understand the path correctly, then you need to go through an understanding of what the four truths are, how this leads to liberation, and then through what the nature of the path is, that leads to Buddhahood. And so, next year, when we do the subject matter for next year, then a discussion on the four truths, how the four truths are, how they are to be understood, and then there are certain positions of the non-Buddhists that come up and say this is what the path is, this is a correct understanding of the path, and then there is a discussion and debate on what the correct nature of the path is. That will be addressed next year. In the third year, the main subject matter is emptiness, where what is the correct view that one needs to have to be able to understand, identify correctly the path and then traverse it. And then finally in the fourth year, when one has a correct understanding of what the path is, then what is the sequence in which one progresses along this path. So since that is the aim, that's why these 4 years have been divided in this subject matter in this order. So our aim at the end of this is to say, to ensure that by the end of the fourth year, all of you know this is the Buddhist path, this is how you traverse it. So it's like we've taken this money, we want to ensure that we have this capital and we put it in your hand. Now whether you want to practice it and what you want to do with it is entirely up to you. So we're going to give you this responsibility and say, here, this is now for you. We want to ensure that you have a correct understanding of the path and a correct understanding of the stages of the path. And whether you walk it, you traverse it, that's entirely is going to depend on you. So that's our aim and we'll ensure that that happens. So with that goal in mind, that's why we've separated the subject matter in this way.
So di miyu dinde sim goya dirda. Miyu dinde sim goya di nangba chingi mangbo yor desa nangba chingi mangbo do, nangba chue chingi mangbo do de. Ta ngomini sul kari hago go marde khanda ko tongsho so rawa de. Tongsho so rawa khande yorsana mang cheba lamgi ngo nor deke. Dene lamgi korin me deke. Kawa chomshin dine de chom 아니 람기 뭐 너르시 닝부 가릴랭고 요바디 닝부디 돌 예라서로 주지든데 다 통조로든데 마부 통고요 선자 아니 림부체랑 안줘도 주들시에다 간다디 쇼지 팡보를 하셨다 당기 라와나시 된적이 밀륜이에 가고를 라비 현대 간다 된대니에 가와지 아니 고 노르조지 간도 심고 조지 심바이나 고 팡보인바인데 아니 람기 ngo 줘야 되다 람기 코림 따다지 ngo 줘야 딘디지다 냐버도 구구도 세지 가서 미우디 숨기었다 디인데 나바설 펜도 딘데 용 그랬다
So also the reason why then we had this concern was because we observe, we see that there is nowadays, when we talk about the Dharma, there is generally like a kind of overarching misconception about what the Dharma is or what it entails, what dharmic practice entails. And there also seems to be a sort of shortage in understanding what the correct order or what the sequence of practicing the Dharma is. And so when we see now, it's quite evident that people pick and choose from different moments and do things that are not appropriate right now. They do them later, or things that should be done later are kind of focused on now, which then don't give any result. Also, when we think about what the path is or what Dharma practice is, without realizing the real essence of Dharma, we kind of focus on some sort of peripheral, secondary thing as our main practice. And because it's obvious that there is a general misconception about what dharmic practice is and how to go about doing it, because we have this kind of concern about how precious this dharma is, which could get lost in discussing it with Rinpoche, then we felt that it is essential that we can kind of provide a correct understanding of what the dharma is, the essence of dharma, and then how to go about practicing it. And so I'm sure certain that this will be beneficial.
Tadi nga zo yungure, tarikado yungure, tarikado nga zo, tarikado la nga zo tayanda somligirwa, ranshinge tayanda, deda yanda, mamibi tayanda somligirwa. Soza da deda yanda gado le yundi, deda yanda la pei tado tyungi tasa nyi kugire. Nga zo jangayadi tango pei taga le kuya le laba yoro diden la juju meyo di tuwa yubi shirsi. Tuwa lani meshe tangas labarwa, chuja lani chushe tangas pei tadi kugire de, an tyungi tala, ani ringni tsema tali shirsi. 장주 sembo lodengi ringni tsema tali shie seja ani 장주 ko 장주 semba yimba da ko di yimba da ta kharida demba yina ani ko di yoba tyongi ta koya yore tenzo nyamlen de geje ligirwa tyongi ta koya yore ani rangshingi ta yandala dagarare pe tala ngajo daji mita cheba yimbi sis ko gorte tyongi tala ngajo chujin nyelengi phungbu susugi phungbu de khadu yin midaba jubedireda phungbu midaba jubedi ngajo tyongi tari nyamlengi tari 풍부 미다바 줍고고였다. 풍부 미다발라 때네 동해와 고고래. 풍부 미다발라 때네 다 동바 고고고래. 선자 다 동바이면 다 최담지 동시 다음에 봐서에게 다 동바이마다 다음에 임바도 동해와 임바도 주 사마 투서디 풍부 미다바 디가나 투고요래. 선자 디인디 딘주 퇴게 다 디가에 리기래. 마미미 다 가도래 빼다 용거래 퇴게 다 용거래. 베이탈랑 아주 샤사 유메 타치도 그 말이 가서 샤사를 견디는 소에 가사 임비치를 라와 나신지 되게 달라 나랑도 미션을 균지 제기로 봐 아주 미션을 균지 제윤데 미션 밖에 규 나랑서라 시규딩 아주로 견디네 고도 규대 버봐 레디네 아주기 다 치료기 다상에 담면하게 돈에 다 담면다 question 아주 킬린신 담면신 로디거로 들 상마 튕겼다 이 상마 아주 따리카도 리기리 따리카도를 아주 저기저기신 공기 튀는 그래서
So the next one was, can we choose slightly more relevant subjects instead of things like pots and pillars? That will happen, because in Tariq, when you do Tariq and you're debating Tariq, you give reasons, and so that will it will happen in any case, because when you do the different kind of reasonings in Tariq, you do reasons which are proving causes through effects, then you're proving the same nature, or you're saying certain things don't exist. And so the way that you go about understanding these reasons or these syllogisms is through easier things to understand, because it's easier to use examples such as smoke and fire. But the point of using these reasons or this kind of reasoning is to show that a bodhisattva who has a certain realization, or somebody who has a certain realization, how do you gauge where someone is, what someone's understanding is, through what kind of sign or what kind of proof can you use to infer what someone is experiencing. And then, for example, when you're talking about same nature relations, you talk about sound being impermanent because it's produced, but actually you need to use that on your aggregates. And it's essential and fundamental that we use reason to prove that our aggregates are impermanent, because it is through the understanding of impermanence of our aggregates that we then derive the understanding that they are the nature of suffering, and then that they lack a self, or they are empty of a self. And so since this follows directly from a realization of impermanence, the reasons that we use, the examples are all examples that sound unrelated, but then later you have to take them onto subjects which are relevant. Similarly, when you do what are called non-observation science, you talk about these funny things such as flesh eaters and how you cannot be sure whether they exist or not. But the point later is, if you're not able to ascertain the qualities of someone or their inner virtues or non-virtues, if you pass judgment about how they really are, is inaccurate. So as we move ahead with Tariq, you'll see that the examples given in the text are then to be connected to one's everyday life and one's everyday experience. So that's something that will happen as we study Tariq.
The Atisha
will do this. Atisha will do this. And again, so the next one was, can we do the prayers in English if it's more beneficial? So we'll start doing them in English from tomorrow. And did you come on this Mount Hindus? Do you do the come on now with never do Tajo doing soon down lane she chick with the share like this. Can't number Tsugi. What's a cure on us?
Ale. Rerita. Takeja Garichin and some Tenzin as he catches shares to the Yabuers. Not a single level in the year.
My Tsugi.
Anna. So was the Tenzin says a jelly commune, the answer Keja Garichin of some Indians love Radiro. Tina Gigi. At some say. That day, Rege cousin Shu Bimba. Zuba Cadu della, Rilum Tiny Shage to a dirt dama to teachers. Ro? And Langing in the Kaduna, Yaman Damados, Yaman Chabamashons, Yaman Desco, Dishija Gitoni, and Tivatangidi and Tivatangidi and the Imbatas, Imbata Imbichers, Imbata, Imbichers, my Imbichers, could Gumzin Koran gonna do stage chini. Mimi Gejashigi sort of my embassy called to tell cheers at the lab, laying in the Tamadu, Chabamachus, Dikorangan, any Gasachilla Gadukan, any tea in days, like any tea Samotan, Dishakari and Dishijap, and Dishi the Jintana, Tazatang Kavuchigua, and in Dodojimas in the Lavsholan, Dodo Sue Business, could do in the committee in Arta, and Jilamia which haggers.
So the next one was, can you please insist that when people debate, they only stick to debate language instead of these long kind of explanations or these long discussions. And for instance, kind of just jokingly, in IBD, for instance, when you get really familiar with debate language, and even when you're outside, you speak to each other, you start speaking like this. But it's important that you already start developing this habit now, where if you're answering, you just limit your answers to why, accept, reason, or establish, no pervasion. And when you're asking, you only ask, it follows it is this because it is this, or it follows it is not this because it is this, or not this, whatever it is. Because the more you exert yourself, or the more you practice just staying clean with your syllogisms, and when someone is asking, you just limit yourself to using a reason or a syllogism, and when you're responding, you only limit yourself to these kind of replies, then as you may move forward, your ability to reason will become clearer. At most, if every now and then you feel stuck at a certain point where it's not clear what the other person is thinking, you can say something like, take something, it follows it is something else, and if they say why, then you can say, why is it not? Or if they say accept, you can say, why do you accept this? And if the answer is being given, instead of giving a 15-minute answer where then you have nothing to debate on, if you can just essentialize, or you can practice and rehearse essentializing your answers, then you have something to continue debating on. If you keep doing this and you practice this again and again, and you try and limit yourself to this, not as a discussion between two people who are having a conversation, but just using this format, then chances of your ability to reason developing are a lot quicker and fast, and a lot more likely. So abstaining from this kind of conversational way of debating is heavily encouraged.
다 뒤져봐 줘야 지금 뭐임바 단다 텔 칠세기 릴람기 죄지도와 디 냠len 집에 가도라 당기 꿀ուն 줘단 당기 가서 티임바 디 상말라 딘지고는 삼로 따야 돼. 다 가장 가서 고주에 대가는 주임바 최 줍고대 슬라데 따고 줘임바 어 디나신 세제 제게 배나 태고 준비를 몇바 유댕에 장주기 섬나 몇바 유댕에 이나 딘지고지 장주 섬을 제고의 김정 캐셔서 그러봐 신된 제고의 김정 신된 제고의 다 망보도 와 배나 당기 따지 거임바 신기 된 제고도 신신 등의 대화들 등의 미리 실스라로 다 디나시 신기 된 가진 제고랬어요. 김정 찍으라 가딩 친구 임비 실스라로 다도 거도 와 아니 따고요 누가나 아니 단다 심진 카시 소소를 대화지에 매겨로 줘요. 코 가딩 전부 간댔어요. 다 두고로 와. 가딩 전부 임부 두고로 와. 안 가딩 전부 간댔어 두고래. 디 두비인데 아니 개왕가지도 되는 dum나마도 로사면도 와. 개왕가지도 dum는 두고로 와. 디인데 다고 대신 코 상말라 김진 거지. 또 세지 디신이 저런 보시기 손여다. 신의 곰배 값가시 마도 탐지 고신이 된지니 진짜 상마 제검래서 김진 장장 거는 로에 곰게 장냐를 마도 조금 요 말도 조금 더 신이 두배 값지기 요래 아니 돈일을 제바신이 제타를 놔도 양보 조배 값지기 요래 대마도 배신 상만하고 김진 장장 거는 곰게 장냐래 니신 제곰슬라고 김진 거야매 곰게 김진 거야매 버치진 단다 디낭신 시제 간다 신이 딘주연을 텐조니가 있는 치와미다 바이는 레 김대는 김진 마고 버시는 곰갸스 라오시는 게스케요 말다 디디레 그 삼대 버시버도 텔라 몇바 이지슬비로 와 몇바 일에 쳐봤어 디고 제곰 차금으로 제곰라는 그 김진 거야 거와 어디신이다 제마 수수 계란소다 곰갸에 되바 요르와 곰갸에 되바 요르 곰들 누바 튀어거로 곰들 누바 튀어거도 곰 상만 제곰 장냐지 김진 거는 로거로 김진 거라도 당기 따고 당디 로거로 와 수수수 따고 에 캬바 두구면도 초주 두구면도 야 소소 독과 있나요? 독과도 독소 소소 지바당 소소 nen접 소소 지바당 소소 nen접 두신 로거다. 단도 철알로 파주 로거로 소도 니 콤디하고 텐나 제마 곰라이 콤디하고 차기다. 딜 키벤 빼였다.
So this kind of way of trying to stick to the structure is not just something that you do when you're studying or when you're in debate courtyards with partners. It's something that you do always later when you're studying. Whenever you study, everything that you're doing has to be proven through reasoning. You have to understand it through reasoning. For instance, even if you have to develop bodhicitta, I need to be of benefit to others because others wish to be happy or don't wish to suffer. That's a reason. For instance, the way I've been trying to share it with you from the beginning, it's all reasons. It's just one reason after another. For example, you can also give another reason about why you need to work for the benefit of others. You can say, I need to work for the benefit of others because they're kind to me. But then you look around you and you find people who you have no connection with. So why are they kind to you? You have to prove that they are kind to you. Now to prove that, you can't do that without talking about previous lives where they have been kind to you. And so everything that you do, when it turns into a meditation, it is something that has to be sustained by reasoning. That's why Lama Tsongkhapa in his Lamrim Chemu, he says, apart from certain moments when you are cultivating calm abiding, everything from relying on a spiritual guide all the way to the very end is analytic meditation. And analytical meditation is when you have to give yourself a reason, and if you have to see whether for you that reason is established. If it's not established, how will you prove that reason to you? If there is pervasion or not, if there's no pervasion, how do you prove the pervasion? If you have a doubt that comes up, then how do you tackle that doubt? If you have a conviction that you have that suddenly seems shaky, how do you reaffirm that conviction? Through reasoning. So right now you're doing it with each other as pairs, and you're trying to develop this habit while talking to each other. But eventually when you're sitting down and meditating, because all of you do want to meditate, that seems to be something that we're all concerned with. All the meditations are analytical meditations. If you don't do this, then how are you going to make that meditation or that realization, that experience potent? Otherwise what you end up doing is you just repeat things, like they become like affirmations where you just say things to yourself. That kind of meditation where you're just making affirmations and making statements to yourself is called a form of it's like recollecting things that inspire you. It's like recollecting inspirational thoughts. It's like a self-affirmation. But if you really want to make your conviction in the teachings of the Dharma and your understanding of the Dharma potent and real, then this thing that you're practicing with each other has to become something that you can do by yourself. Even with emptiness, only when you have completely removed all doubt with respect to emptiness, are there certain instances where you just stay in a single-pointed realization or undistracted, unwavering state of concentration. Beyond that, from the very beginning to the very end, every single practice that is done is an analytical meditation, and analytical meditation is done through reasoning. So right now when you're doing it with each other, if you're not going to be able to develop this ability when you're sitting down by yourself, having it happen is extremely difficult. So that's why you try and stay as clean and precise with the structure as you can when you're debating now, because then that's going to become your approach later when you meditate by yourself. So for instance, if you are talking about practice of refuge, or you want to have the realization of refuge or to go for refuge, you first have to give a reason for why you need to go for refuge. And to give a reason for why you need to go for refuge to the three jewels is you have to say yourself, I have to go for refuge because I am going to take an inferior rebirth. So if you cannot prove that you're going to take an inferior rebirth and you're not certain that you're going to take an inferior rebirth, then why do you need to go about taking refuge in something? So I am going to have an inferior rebirth. That's your thesis, that's your position. If you can't prove it or verify it through reason, why are you going to go about taking refuge? Similarly, earlier I forgot, if you're going to say I am a Mahayana practitioner or I need to practice bodhicitta, if you can't give a reason to support why you need to do it, then how are you going to go about actually feeling like it's important or required for you?
Ta dinashi kamru chela godwa. Ta simge gombala simge ki tsawa ningje Ningji sedu shen jinjin re, di dongsho de rang jinjin re, suzo rang jinjin ngay la dungi tamche ki tsawa yinba dhub korwa, suzo rang jinjin chi dungi kungi tsawa yin de taa go korwa. Taa di kanti dhub do, kyaba kanti dhub di samwa do korwa ngay la, di samwa tanya me na rang jinjin dungi kungi tsawa yinba lab tuk marwa. Rang jinjin dungi kungi tsawa yinba lama to na, ani nga zo lab de de, jikden dewa chenye ba tikungi rang de de le shos. Jikden dungi chenye ba tikungi rang de de le shos. Jikden dewa chenye ba tikungi shen de de le shos la di, ko tsik gyorai shimado tenda goya keme do.
So like refuge, now you need reasons to prove that you're going to take an inferior rebirth. If you can't prove that, then there's no point in going for refuge. Similarly, when you're trying to develop bodhicitta, you have to develop loving kindness. To develop loving kindness, you have to develop cherishing others over oneself. The obstacle is cherishing oneself. So you need to get rid of cherishing oneself. So you need to say, take self-cherishing. It follows it is to be abandoned, or it follows it is the root of all suffering. If you can't prove that it is the root of all suffering, you can't give yourself a reason why it is the root of all suffering. You can't prove the pervasion that because that is the case, it is the root of all suffering. Then that beautiful verse by Shantideva which says, concerned with one's own happiness is the root of all suffering. Being concerned with loving others or concern for others is the root of all happiness, is just a nice verse that is just a nice saying. You go around saying it because it sounds nice, but you have no conviction founded in it. So if you can't give reasons to support whatever practice you do, then it's just kind of pleasantries. It's nice words, it sounds nice, but you're not really certain of anything.
Oda di indi ani chera nala koron tagara di gyumzen yang goju gyumzen yang tri loshin ko bejen chebe ne yagudo.
So that's why with that goal in mind, if you from now already get into the habit of just limiting your interactions in this structure when you're debating in the evening and now in the afternoons, just when you're asking, you give the syllogism, and when you're replying, you just give the 4 responses. Then if you develop that habit now, then it's helpful also, finally, for that.
Jambe mbao jedara gemba don kondo sangbo tenyang dejende deda gunge jeso da lobje gewa deda thamje rabdo.